I was knee-deep in my usual routine, answering work emails and catching up on the day's tasks when the notification popped up on my screen. High school reunion, 10 years. It felt like a time bomb sitting in my inbox, waiting to go off. I stared at it for a long time, feeling a strange, hollow ache in my chest. I hadn't thought about high school in years, hadn't stayed in touch with anyone from that time. It had been a clean break, the kind you make when you want to leave everything behind and start fresh. But there was something about that email, that simple line of text, that made me pause. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, as memories flickered through my mind like an old, grainy film. I thought about those late-night drives with my best friend, Mark, the windows rolled down, music blasting as we sped through empty streets. I thought about the small, hidden spots around town where we'd sneak off to avoid everyone else, just the two of us against the world. He'd been the kind of friend you imagine will always be there, and for a while, I'd believed he would be. The thing was, I hadn't spoken to Mark since the week after graduation. One day, he was just gone. No explanation, no goodbye. I'd called, texted, even driven to his house a few times, but every attempt was met with silence. Eventually, I let it go, told myself to move on, but every now and then, when life got quiet, I'd think about him, wonder what had happened, if he was somewhere out there, wondering about me too. As the reunion date drew closer, I found myself checking my email more often, hoping for an RSVP from him, half dreading and half anticipating it. But every time I looked, his name was missing from the list. It felt like a strange kind of loss, one that had lingered for years but never fully settled. On the day of the reunion, I almost didn't go. I'd put on a shirt, taken it off, paced around my apartment, debating whether it was worth the trip. But something kept pulling me back, a quiet urge, a need to see if there was anything left of the life I'd once had. The venue was a rented hall in our old town, filled with familiar faces that looked older, wiser, softened by the years. People I'd once known stopped me, asking about my job, my life, each conversation blurring into the next. I'd forgotten how easy it was to slip back into the patterns, the old roles, like we were all playing parts in a script we'd long since memorized. But every time I scanned the room, my eyes searched for one face, the face I knew wouldn't be there. It was almost midnight when I finally stepped outside, needing a breath of fresh air. The air was cool, crisp, carrying the faint smell of pine and earth that reminded me of nights spent in the woods with Mark, telling stories under the stars. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through old photos, as if the answers to my questions might somehow be hidden there. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw someone standing by the edge of the parking lot, leaning against an old, beat-up car, a cigarette glowing faintly in the dark. My heart stopped. "Mark!" I called, barely believing my own voice. The figure turned, and for a moment, it felt like no time had passed at all. He looked the same but different, a little older, a little rougher around the edges. But those eyes, that familiar smirk, were exactly as I remembered. "Hey," he said, his voice low and almost hesitant, like he wasn't sure he should be there. We stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of 10 years pressing down on us. I wanted to say a million things, to ask him where he'd been, why he'd disappeared, but the words felt stuck, tangled in a decade's worth of questions. "You look good," he said finally, flicking his cigarette to the ground, the glow extinguishing with a soft hiss. I laughed, the sound strange in the stillness. "You too. Where have you been, Mark?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Everywhere and nowhere, I guess. Life got messy." He glanced down, kicking at the gravel with his shoe. "I never planned on leaving like that. But things just happened." There was a sadness in his voice, a heaviness I didn't remember, and it took everything in me not to reach out, to close the gap between us. "You could have told me," I said softly. "You could have said goodbye." He looked up, his eyes meeting mine with a mixture of regret and something else, something raw, vulnerable. "I didn't know how to explain it back then," he murmured. "Didn't know how to say that I was scared, that I didn't know where I was going, or who I was anymore. I thought leaving would make it easier, cleaner." I took a shaky breath, the weight of his words settling in. "It wasn't, though. Not for me. He nodded, his gaze drifting to the darkened windows of the hall behind us. I know. I thought about you a lot over the years. Wondered if you hated me, if you'd ever forgive me. I didn't know what to say to that. There was a part of me that wanted to hold on to the hurt, to make him feel the sting of every unanswered question, every silent night spent wondering. But as I stood there, looking at him, I realized that it didn't matter. Not anymore. So, are you back for good? I asked, my voice quiet, careful. He shrugged, a small, almost defeated gesture. I don't know. Maybe. There's not much left for me out there, and this place, well, it still feels like home. Sometimes. We stood there, side by side, the silence between us feeling like both a bridge and a chasm, an unspoken understanding that didn't need words. I felt a strange kind of peace settle over me, a sense that maybe, just maybe, this was enough, that we didn't need to go back, to fix the past or untangle the knots of what had happened. We just needed to be here, now in this moment. Want to go for a drive? He asked, a small, hopeful smile tugging at his lips. I nodded, my heart pounding with the thrill of old memories, the promise of something familiar, something real. We climbed into his car, and as the engine rumbled to life, I felt a weight lift, a lightness I hadn't felt in years. We drove through the empty streets, past the old school, the park where we'd spent countless afternoons, the diner where we'd shared late-night milkshakes. It was like stepping back into a dream, a time capsule of everything we'd been, everything we'd lost. Remember that spot by the lake? He asked, glancing over at me, his eyes bright with mischief. I laughed, shaking my head. How could I forget? You nearly got us caught sneaking out there. He grinned, turning onto a familiar dirt road, the headlights cutting through the darkness. We parked by the water, the same spot we'd claimed as ours so many years ago. The lake was calm, the moon casting a soft glow over the rippling surface. We sat on the hood of the car, staring out at the water, the silence filled with memories that needed no words. After a while, he spoke, his voice barely more than a whisper. I'm sorry, for everything, for leaving like that. I should have been better. I looked at him, seeing the boy he'd been, the man he'd become, and all the years that had shaped us in ways we couldn't have understood back then. I know, Mark, and I forgive you. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the water, a quiet, grateful smile tugging at his lips. We sat there until the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting a warm glow over the lake, over us, over the fragile, unfinished story that was somehow finding its way again. As the sun rose, I felt a strange sense of closure, a peace that had eluded me for years. Maybe things hadn't turned out the way we'd planned, but in that moment it didn't matter. We were here, together, in the place where it had all begun, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. It all began with a loaf of sourdough. To be clear, I'd never been much of a baker. Sure, I could handle a batch of cookies from time to time, but that was about it. My real specialty was a rock-solid, questionable attempt at banana bread, which only my most loyal friends could eat without a polite cough. Then, like everyone else during the early months of lockdown, I found myself spending a lot more time at home and scrolling through social media, where it seemed like every third post featured a gorgeous, golden loaf of sourdough with that telltale artisan split down the middle. And without warning, I was intrigued. I didn't realize that baking sourdough involved taking care of a starter, a bubbly, yeasty mixture that you had to feed and tend to every day, like some kind of finicky dough-based pet. But the more I read, the more determined I was to give it a shot. I found a recipe online, whipped up my first batch of flour and water, and began waiting for those little bubbles to appear. In the beginning, I was an absolute disaster. My first loaf was more like a doorstop than a piece of bread. My second attempt didn't rise at all, so it came out flat, dense, and looked nothing like the photos I'd seen. But something about the process hooked me. It was calming, therapeutic even, and after a few weeks of practice, I finally pulled out a loaf with a proper rise and a crisp crust. I was ecstatic, posting a photo of my loaf on Instagram as if I just climbed Everest. The next day, a friend messaged me, half joking, "Hey, you should make me one." I laughed it off, but she kept asking, and I figured why not? It was something to do. So, I made her a loaf, and then another friend wanted one. Before I knew it, I was baking a few loaves a week just to share with friends, mostly as an excuse to keep experimenting with my new hobby. Then one night, I got a message from a woman I barely knew, a friend of a friend who had seen my bread posts. She asked if I'd sell her a loaf. I laughed out loud. Selling bread? That seemed like the most ridiculous thing in the world. I was just baking for fun, but she insisted, and after a bit of back and forth, I told her I'd charge $10, barely enough to cover ingredients, but it felt strange asking for money at all. The next day, she Venmo'd me without hesitation and picked up her loaf from my doorstep. 2 days later, she sent me a photo of her breakfast, a slice of my bread slathered with jam. "Best toast I've ever had," she wrote, and suddenly I was floored. She tagged me in her post, and within an hour, I had 3 more messages asking if I'd sell them a loaf. I started telling people I could only bake on Saturdays since I was still working from home during the week, but it didn't stop the orders from rolling in. That's when I realized I might actually have a little business on my hands. I created a small order form on Google Docs, added a bread by Saturday highlight to my Instagram, and figured I'd see how long people were interested. To my surprise, they were more than interested. They were obsessed. By the end of the month, I had a full roster of weekly orders. It was incredible, but I was quickly running out of space in my kitchen. So I invested in a larger Dutch oven, upgraded my mixer, and started waking up early on Saturdays to get everything done. Soon, my apartment smelled like a bakery every weekend, and my countertops were constantly covered in proofing baskets and flour. I had a list of signature loaves, which still sounds ridiculous to say, including a rosemary and sea salt loaf, a dark chocolate and cranberry loaf, and a classic country sourdough that had become a favorite. Around this time, I began experimenting with new flavors and toppings, and people started requesting special loaves for birthdays, brunches, and even small weddings. I found myself baking for events I'd never have dreamed of attending, and even though I was operating out of my tiny kitchen, I started thinking about expanding. Then a friend in the restaurant industry called me up and said, "Hey, I told my manager about your bread. He's interested in featuring it as the house bread at our restaurant. Do you think you want to do that?" I was speechless. It was just me, my kitchen, and my beginner sourdough skills. This was way out of my league. But I went to meet the manager, brought him a few samples, and shockingly, he loved it. We set up a trial run for a month, and just like that, my Saturday side hustle became a small bread business. Every Friday, I'd bake a dozen loaves for the restaurant in addition to my orders, and eventually, the restaurant added my name to the menu. House Bread by my name. Seeing it printed on their menu felt surreal. It wasn't the Michelin-starred restaurant down the street or anything, but to me, it felt like I'd made it. The restaurant gig went well, and soon they were asking for more loaves each week. I decided it was time to take a risk. I rented space at a local commercial kitchen and started baking twice as much as before. With this setup, I could accept even more orders, and by the end of the year, I had a steady stream of customers, both locals and a few who'd found me on Instagram and were willing to drive across town just to pick up my bread. And then, right when I thought things couldn't get any better, a well-known food blogger in the area ordered a few loaves and posted about them on her blog. The next day, my inbox was flooded. People were asking if I shipped loaves, which unfortunately I didn't, and local bakeries even reached out about carrying my bread. It was overwhelming in the best possible way. I eventually quit my day job, taking the leap into full-time baking, and rented a permanent spot in the commercial kitchen. I hired 2 part-time helpers, invested in professional equipment, and even designed a logo. Now, Loaf Love, the name I settled on after countless brainstorming sessions, is a small, thriving business. I never imagined my life would revolve around dough and flour. But here I am. Looking back, it's hard to believe it all started with one stubborn attempt at sourdough and a loaf for a friend. I've learned more than I ever thought possible. Not just about baking, but about patience, resilience, and the power of taking risks on things that don't seem to make sense at first. I found something that fills me with pride, and every day, I'm grateful for the strange twist that led me here. Now, when I see someone else sharing their first loaf online, struggling through the same challenges I did, I can't help but smile. Who knows? Maybe their bread journey will take them somewhere surprising too. My friend Dave has this story about his time working for a big tech company that gets us rolling every time he tells it, though it left him thoroughly disillusioned about corporate life. He'd been working there for about a year when his team got roped into what his manager called a major opportunity. The company had decided to create a new app to help streamline project management for small businesses, and Dave's team would be the core developers. It sounded big. The catch: they had 6 weeks to build it from scratch. At first, Dave was pumped. He loved a challenge, and the team was equally excited. They dove in, working late nights, skipping weekends, ordering enough takeout that their desks started looking like a food court. The app took shape, and with a few days to spare, they created a clean, functional beta that they were genuinely proud of. They were exhausted, but figured it was worth it. Finally, the day came to present it to the execs. Dave and his team filed into a conference room, where a row of high-level suits sat waiting, looking unusually serious. As soon as they launched into their demo, one of the execs stopped them. Wait, he said, shaking his head. Who authorized this design? The room went silent. Dave's manager started to stammer, but the exec didn't even look at him. This is nothing like what we asked for, he went on, flipping through the app like it was a toy. The entire project is off track. They were floored. Apparently, the execs had wanted a flashy, almost game-like interface with pop-up reminders, notifications, all sorts of bells and whistles. They'd thought the team had been briefed, but somehow, the messaging had never gotten through. And just like that, months of work were dismissed. Dave's team had to start over with a whole new concept that wasn't what any of them believed in, but they didn't have a choice. They were stuck rebuilding this app to please people who hadn't even bothered to check in on the project until the very end. But here's the kicker. After another grueling 6 weeks, they delivered the new version. Clunky, cluttered, and completely impractical for the small businesses it was meant to serve. The execs approved it, slapped the company logo on it, and rolled it out with a big PR push. Within 2 months, the app had flopped spectacularly. Reviews were terrible, feedback was worse, and support requests were through the roof. Customers hated the complicated interface and constant notifications, saying it was more of a distraction than a help. The company ended up pulling the app, citing realignment of priorities. Dave's team was devastated, but what really stung was that none of the execs took any responsibility. Instead, they threw the team under the bus, citing implementation issues and making it sound like Dave's team hadn't delivered on their end. For Dave, it was a wake-up call. He'd gone in with all this excitement, thinking he'd get to create something useful, something that would actually help people, only to be used as a scapegoat when the exec's bad decisions inevitably blew up. He left the company a few months later, and now whenever someone mentions the word alignment or core objectives, he practically breaks out in hives. He jokes that corporate lingo gives him PTSD, but he's only half joking. These days, he works for a tiny startup, choosing passion projects over prestige. He says he'd rather work with a team that actually cares about what they're building than get blindsided by people who couldn't care less. It's safe to say that job changed his entire outlook on the tech industry, and honestly, I don't blame him one bit. I met Nick through a mutual friend who swore he was the nicest guy. We'd all gone to a bar one night, and he seemed fun, a little reserved but thoughtful, the kind of guy who doesn't need to be the loudest in the room. He asked if I wanted to grab dinner sometime, and I said yes, thinking it would be refreshing to go out with someone a little quieter and grounded for a change. The date started off well enough. He picked a cozy Italian place that wasn't too crowded, and he arrived a few minutes early, which I appreciated. He looked genuinely happy to see me, and we quickly settled into an easy conversation. We talked about movies, work, travel, the usual stuff. I was starting to think I'd finally found a guy who was normal, someone who actually listened, which is a rare trait on dates these days. He even laughed at my jokes, and not in that polite way people do when they just want to move on to their own stories. He seemed genuinely interested, which made me start to relax and enjoy myself. We were halfway through our pasta when things took a sharp, unexpected turn. I don't even remember what triggered it. Maybe a mention of family or relationships. Suddenly, he got this intense look in his eyes and said, I think dating should have rules. Like a clear, formal structure. I laughed, thinking he was joking, but he didn't laugh back. He leaned forward and explained that he developed his own rules for dating, which, as he put it, simplified things. Curious but cautious, I asked him what he meant by rules. He nodded, clearly thrilled to have the chance to explain. Well, Rule 1, he began with the authority of a professor, is that both people should share their entire dating history on the first date. No surprises. He seemed to think this was perfectly reasonable, while I blinked in surprise, thinking of all the awkward conversations that would entail. Rule 2, he continued, is that you have to meet each other's friends by the third date. Because if it doesn't work with the friends, it won't work at all. He said this like he was laying out undeniable scientific facts. I nodded slowly, trying to picture myself casually introducing every single person I dated to my friends by date 3, as if they were some kind of jury who'd decide if I got to keep seeing the guy. And rule 3, he added, lowering his voice dramatically, is no social media. At all. He shook his head solemnly, like he'd seen unspeakable horrors on Instagram and was now on a crusade to save everyone from them. Social media is toxic for relationships. It's all about privacy and focus. I tried to reason with him, pointing out that maybe it depended on the couple, but he shook his head. No exceptions, he insisted. It ruins everything. At this point, I was equal parts amused and concerned. He seemed so sure of himself, so convinced that he'd cracked some kind of relationship code. I half expected him to pull out a written list for me to sign an agreement. I tried to steer the conversation back to something lighter, but he was on a roll now. He went on to share his 4th rule: no texting after 10 p.m. because, in his view, late-night texting leads to impulsive emotions. By now, I was regretting the second glass of wine that meant I'd have to stay longer to sober up before leaving. So I kept listening, nodding along, when he hit me with Rule 5, no compliments until at least the 5th date. I must have looked utterly baffled because he explained, it's about keeping things real, you know? Compliments too early just give people big heads. That's when he shared his proudest rule of all, Rule 6. He leaned in close, his face serious, and said, if you're serious about someone, you ask them for a copy of their credit score. He shrugged like it was obvious, saying, money issues ruin relationships all the time. Why wait to find out? I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Here I was sitting across from someone who genuinely believed that a first date should involve asking for financial paperwork. Finally, I decided to be direct. So, how have these rules worked for you? I asked, genuinely curious how many people had stuck around past Rule 4. He looked down at his plate, suddenly a little sheepish. Well, people don't always understand. I guess some people find it intense. I tried to suppress a laugh, nodding sympathetically. The check finally arrived, and we split it. He seemed relieved, explaining how he didn't believe in paying for dates until at least the 4th meeting. It just sets up unrealistic expectations, he said, as if he were imparting life-changing wisdom. I just nodded, smiling, while my mind was already plotting my escape. He walked me to my car, and when he leaned in for a hug, he whispered, just think about the rules. They work if you let them. On the drive home, I couldn't stop laughing. It was like he'd crafted his entire dating life into a series of spreadsheets and guidelines. The more I thought about it, the funnier it got. It was as if he thought he was some dating guru, like he'd unlocked all the secrets to love and romance with his bizarre checklist. I knew I wouldn't see him again, but for a while, I couldn't stop telling everyone about Rule Guy, the man who thought dating was as simple as following a set of rigid regulations. It made me wonder about all the things people do to protect themselves from getting hurt. Walls, rules, structures to make everything predictable. But love isn't like that. It's messy and random and sometimes unpredictable. If he ever figured that out, maybe he'd have better luck. But for me, it was a reminder that maybe the best dates are the ones with no rules. In my senior year, our school organized this big end-of-year camping trip at a nearby lake. It was supposed to be all about bonding, campfire songs, and some lame group activities that no one was really excited about. But my friend group, along with half the senior class, had other plans. We smuggled in a ridiculous amount of snacks, a Bluetooth speaker, and somehow a piñata stuffed with candy, party poppers, and the occasional questionable item we won't mention. The first night started pretty tame, with the teachers telling ghost stories around the campfire, and everyone pretending to be mildly spooked. But once the teachers hit their tents, the real camping trip began. Someone had brought glow sticks, and soon enough, they were lighting up the dark like little beacons, leading us out toward the lake for what quickly turned into a midnight glow stick hunt. We'd throw them in the water, daring each other to swim out and grab them while the rest of us cheered and taunted from the shore. But the real chaos didn't start until my friend Ellie got it in her head that we needed to raid the teacher's food stash. Apparently, she'd heard that they had actual S. More's ingredients, which were off limits to us since they wanted us to rough it. In no time, she was leading a ragtag team of us, stealthily creeping toward the teacher's tent area. We made it all the way to Mr. Green's tent and froze, listening to see if he was asleep. Ellie whispered, "This is it, people. The jackpot." She unzipped the tent flap and slipped in like some kind of sugar-hungry ninja, emerging a minute later with a half-empty bag of marshmallows clutched in her hand like it was the Holy Grail. We were almost back to our own tents, giggling over our successful heist, when suddenly we saw flashlights flicking on from all directions. We froze. Then Ellie, without a hint of panic, stuffed the marshmallows under her shirt and hissed, "Run!" It was pure pandemonium, everyone darting off in different directions, teachers shouting, and someone tripping over a rock and rolling down a small hill like a cartoon character. Ellie and I bolted into the woods, crashing through the trees and laughing like maniacs, thinking we'd completely evaded capture. But the universe had other plans. As we rounded a cluster of trees, we ran smack into Mrs. Henderson, our history teacher, standing there with her arms crossed and the most unimpressed look on her face. Ellie still had marshmallows spilling out of her shirt, but she played it cool, shrugged, and said, "Late night snack?" The teachers tried to corral everyone back into their tents after that, but the damage was done. Fueled by our mini adventure, the whole camp erupted in a spontaneous, low-key rebellion. Someone got the brilliant idea to pull out the Bluetooth speaker, and suddenly there was a mini dance party happening by the lake. Teachers kept trying to break it up, but every time they shone their flashlights on us, we'd scatter into the darkness, only to regroup somewhere else. It was like the entire senior class had turned into a bunch of rogue raccoons, just popping up and causing mayhem. The next morning, we got the usual lecture, with the teachers saying we'd let them down and compromise the spirit of the trip, which they clearly expected to gild us. But all of us just sat there, exhausted but proud, barely able to hold back our laughter. And when we finally got back to school, everyone knew about the great s'mores heist and the midnight dance party by the lake. It was the perfect ending to high school, and to this day, I can't see a marshmallow without thinking of Ellie and that wild night under the stars. I was running late, juggling grocery bags and my phone, trying to balance it all while also attempting to hail a cab. As I struggled, a carton of eggs teetered on the edge of one bag, and in a slow-motion disaster, it slipped, plummeting toward the sidewalk. Just as I braced myself for the mess, a hand darted out from nowhere and caught it. "Gotcha," the guy said, holding up the carton triumphantly, flashing a sheepish smile. He looked about my age, with tousled hair, and wearing one of those well-worn hoodies that looked absurdly comfortable. I was so relieved and embarrassed that I couldn't help but laugh. "Thanks. You just saved breakfast," I said, trying to hold my bags together. He shrugged. "Glad I could be of service. You look like you're on a mission. More like a chaotic grocery run gone wrong," I replied, shifting the bags. Before I could offer another awkward thank you and dash off, he tilted his head toward the coffee shop behind him. "Look, you seem a bit overloaded. Can I offer you a coffee as a reward for catching that carton?" I hesitated, caught off guard by his kindness, but something about his smile made it hard to say no. "All right, coffee sounds good," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. He held the door for me, and soon we were tucked in a cozy corner with 2 steaming cups in front of us. "By the way, I'm Alex," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Professional egg saver and part-time caffeine enthusiast." "Nice to meet you, Alex," I replied, stifling a laugh. "I'm Maya, full-time grocery juggler and accidental egg dropper." We slipped into an easy conversation, and before I knew it, we were laughing about everything from terrible college roommates to the weirdest things we'd bought at grocery stores. Alex had this way of talking that made me feel like we'd known each other for years instead of minutes. I barely noticed time passing until I glanced outside and realized the sky had turned dark, the last hints of daylight fading into the city's neon glow. "So tell me," he said, his eyes sparkling with mischief, "what was the story behind all those groceries? Planning a feast?" I smiled, a little embarrassed. "Actually, it's sort of a thing I do every Friday." I try to recreate random recipes I find online. Tonight, it's homemade pasta. His eyebrows shot up. Ambitious. You're really diving into the deep end of cooking, huh? I laughed. Let's just say the results are unpredictable. Well, you're brave, he said, grinning. The most I can handle is instant ramen and scrambled eggs. As we bantered back and forth, I realized we'd been talking for nearly 2 hours. I was surprised by how natural it felt to be there with him, trading stories and jokes like old friends. But as much as I wanted to stay, I knew I had a mountain of groceries and a pasta experiment waiting for me. All right, I should probably get going before my groceries defrost in a soup, I said, reluctantly gathering my bags. He looked a little disappointed, then nodded, offering a shy smile. Fair enough. But hey, since you're going all in on this pasta thing, maybe I could get a taste test invite sometime? I blinked, surprised but intrigued. You're really willing to risk it? For good pasta, I'll take my chances, he replied with a playful grin. Feeling daring, I pulled out my phone and handed it to him. All right, give me your number. You might just get that invite. He took my phone, typing in his number, and handed it back with a smile. Looking forward to it, Chef Maya. We exchanged a quick goodbye, and as I walked away, I couldn't help but grin. The city lights glowed around me. The grocery bags felt lighter, and I felt an unexpected thrill at the idea of seeing him again. The whole way home, I thought about how sometimes even the smallest, most random moments could lead to the best surprises. It was a small, quiet town, the kind where everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least thought they did. I was back home after moving to the city for work, staying with my parents for a while to save up. Everything seemed different, but exactly the same people in the same places, doing the same things. One night, I was out with an old friend, Tom, who invited me over to his place for a drink. It was just us and his mom, Julia, who was recently separated from his dad. She seemed happier than I'd ever seen her, laughing and telling stories with this easy confidence. She'd always been kind of like a second mom to me growing up, making sure I had a place to crash when Tom and I got into one scrape or another. At some point, Tom went out to meet up with his girlfriend, and it was just Julia and me left in the living room. We talked about everything, her separation, my plans, old memories. She poured us a bit more wine, and then a bit more after that. I noticed how she kept glancing at me, this look I hadn't seen before. I tried to ignore it, chalk it up to the wine and nostalgia, but the air between us was shifting. Do you remember when you and Tom used to raid my liquor cabinet? She asked with a smirk. I laughed nervously. I think you knew all along, didn't you? I said. She smiled and leaned in, and suddenly her hand was on my knee. I knew about a lot of things, she said softly, her eyes lingering a moment too long. Everything in me told me to back away, to call it a night. But instead, I leaned in and we kissed. It was surreal, my mind buzzing with disbelief even as it was happening. We stumbled back to her bedroom, the world outside fading away. In the morning, I woke up with a splitting headache and a wave of regret. I quietly dressed and slipped out of the house, hoping to avoid any awkward goodbyes. I tried to convince myself it was a one-time thing, a strange lapse in judgment. But a week later, she texted me, inviting me over while Tom was out. Against all logic, I went, and soon it became a pattern, sneaking around, meeting at her house, or out in random places where no one would recognize us. It was thrilling and terrifying all at once, a secret tangled in my stomach every time I saw Tom. Eventually, though, Tom figured out something was off. One night, we were all at a bar, and he asked why I'd been acting weird. I mumbled an excuse, but he kept pressing, his expression darkening. Julia was avoiding his gaze, and in a heartbeat, it was all over his face. He looked from me to his mom, back and forth, piecing it together, disbelief melting into anger. He shoved me, muttering something under his breath, then stormed out. I could still hear his voice shouting curses as he walked away. I tried to reach out to explain, but he blocked me everywhere. Julia told me it was better to just leave things alone, to let him heal. Eventually, I left town again, cutting ties completely, carrying the weight of what I'd done. And now, every time I think of that quiet town, I feel a strange mix of nostalgia and shame for a friendship I destroyed over something I never should have let happen. I still remember my first shift at the phone sex hotline, sitting there in my tiny apartment with my heart racing, staring at the phone like it might explode in my hands. I found the job through a friend who swore it was easy money and even kind of fun once you got the hang of it. She made it sound so casual, like, oh, you just answer a few calls, talk sweet to some lonely people, and boom, you're paid. I wasn't sure how much of that was true, but with bills stacking up, I figured, why not? They gave me a script, a basic set of prompts to help me steer the conversations, but it was clear they expected us to improvise. And I was supposed to create a persona, Layla. Layla was supposed to be sultry, mature, and calm under pressure, none of which I felt in that moment. I was just a nervous grad student with a makeshift setup in my closet, praying no one would hear through the walls. The first call came in just as I was trying to settle myself. I remember practically jumping out of my chair when the phone rang. I took a deep breath, hit accept, and tried to sound smooth as I said, "Hi, this is Layla. What's on your mind tonight?" My voice came out all wrong, like some bad impression of an old Hollywood actress. But the guy on the other end didn't seem to care. He dove right into this story about his long day at work, his cat, and how he'd recently taken up woodworking. I was so caught off guard by the normalcy of it all that I forgot to be nervous. He just wanted someone to talk to, someone to listen. The whole call went by with me nodding along, occasionally tossing in an encouraging or tell me more. When he finally hung up, he thanked me for just being there. It was so unexpectedly sweet, I almost laughed. I was starting to think, hey, maybe this isn't so bad when the next call came in, and it was a total 180. This guy went right into his fantasy without even a hello. He was intense, asking me to play along with scenarios I hadn't even thought to prepare for. I was flustered, trying to keep up, but then I remembered my friend's advice. Just play the role. So I took a deep breath, settled into character, and somehow the words started coming. I don't even remember exactly what I said, but I know he was satisfied. When he hung up, my hands were shaking, but there was a strange sense of accomplishment, too, like I'd survived something. As the night went on, the calls kept coming, each one stranger than the last. There was the guy who just wanted to talk about his comic book collection, the guy who was trying to practice pickup lines and getting them all wrong, and another who seemed to genuinely believe I was his ex-girlfriend back to make amends. I was all over the map, trying to keep up with each new character they imagined I was. It was exhausting and absurd, but somehow I was finding my rhythm. Then, around midnight, I got a call that changed the whole night. The voice on the other end was quiet, almost shy. He was fumbling over his words, telling me how lonely he'd been since his divorce, how he missed the little things like just having someone to talk to at the end of the day. I could hear the vulnerability in his voice, and I found myself softening, responding in a way that was far more genuine than any of my previous calls. We talked for nearly an hour about everything from his favorite movies to his plans to start gardening. When he hung up, he thanked me so sincerely that I felt a lump in my throat. After he disconnected, I sat there in the silence, letting it sink in. This job wasn't just about the bizarre fantasies or the role-playing. It was about connection, about being there for people who had no one else to turn to in that moment. I realized that I'd been so focused on the awkwardness and my nerves that I hadn't stopped to consider what it meant to them. I finished my shift feeling both drained and strangely fulfilled. The job was nothing like I'd expected, and yet it was exactly what I needed, a reminder that even in the strangest circumstances, a little compassion could go a long way. I knew it wouldn't always be easy, but that first night taught me that there was more to this work than I'd ever imagined. The night started with me on autopilot, just another Saturday with the same crew, same bar, same well-worn routine. But somehow, as we squeezed into our favorite booth and ordered the usual round, something felt different. I was restless, craving a change without knowing what that even meant. My friends must have sensed it too, because after a few drinks, they convinced me to check out this new club a few blocks away, a spot known for its late-night chaos and notoriously packed dance floor. I'll admit, I wasn't thrilled at first. The place was overwhelming, loud, and full of people who seemed to know exactly how to let loose in a way I'd forgotten how to. But I gave in, let the music drown out my doubts, and soon enough I was lost in the crowd. moving with a freedom that surprised me. Then I saw him, dancing with a group of friends nearby, his laugh cutting through the noise. There was a looseness to him, a carefree energy that was magnetic. He caught my eye and grinned, as if daring me to join him. And before I knew it, we were dancing together, inches apart, sharing glances that said more than any words could. I'd never been the type to feel an instant connection, but something about him made it feel like we were already on the same wavelength, like we'd both come here searching for the same unnameable thing. We didn't talk much at first. There was something refreshing about not having to fill every moment with words. Instead, we let the music do the talking, leaning into each other, exchanging glances and smiles that kept building an undeniable tension. It felt thrilling, reckless even, as though the world had narrowed down to just the two of us. Eventually, he led me off the dance floor, his hand warm around mine, and we ended up in a quieter corner of the club. He introduced himself as Sam, and we fell into an easy conversation that felt as natural as breathing. It was a blur of banter, shared stories, and laughter, enough to make me forget that just hours earlier I'd been feeling restless, wanting something more. By the time we stepped outside into the cool night air, it felt like we'd known each other for years. He suggested we go for a walk, and I agreed, letting him lead the way. We wandered down quiet streets, the city lights casting a warm glow as we strolled, talking about everything from our favorite movies to the kind of dreams we were too afraid to admit to most people. At some point, he took my hand again, and it felt natural, like we'd been walking together like this all along. When he finally stopped, pulling me close, there was a gentleness in the way he looked at me that made my heart skip. He leaned in slowly, his lips brushing mine in a kiss that was somehow both tender and electric. In that moment, the world felt like it had stopped spinning, leaving just us and the quiet magic of a shared connection. We ended up at his place, still caught in that spell, and the hours melted away in a haze of whispers and laughter, our closeness dissolving any lingering doubts. Being with him felt like slipping into a story I didn't know I was part of, like he'd shown me a version of myself I hadn't seen before. There was a trust in it, an openness that I hadn't expected but found myself surrendering to. When morning came, I woke up to the smell of coffee and the soft sound of Sam humming to himself in the kitchen. For a brief moment, I let myself imagine that this was something more, that maybe we were the exception to the rule. But as I lay there, reality began to settle in, reminding me that nights like these were usually best left as memories, not beginnings. I joined him in the kitchen, and we shared coffee and quiet smiles, both aware of the unspoken rule that this was probably a one-time thing. We talked a little, both pretending it was just another morning, but there was a weight to it that neither of us addressed. When it was time to go, he walked me to the door, his hand lingering on mine just a second too long. I left with a mix of emotions, a little lighter, a little sadder, carrying the warmth of the night with me, but knowing it was already slipping into the past. In the days that followed, I kept thinking back to that night, replaying the feeling of ease and connection we'd shared. It was rare for me to feel that way with someone so quickly, and it left me questioning what I truly wanted. Had I been looking for a fling, a distraction? Or had I been hoping, deep down, for something real? I started to see that maybe, for all the fun of casual encounters, what I was really looking for was something that didn't fade with the morning light. That night with Sam showed me that while spontaneous connections are thrilling, they're not always what I need in the long run. I wanted something that could last beyond a single night, something that felt as real in the daylight as it did in the dark. So now, I approach nights out with a new perspective. I'm still open to the thrill, the possibility, but I'm more honest with myself about what I want. That night taught me that while it's easy to chase the magic of fleeting moments, the kind of connection that lasts is worth holding out for. And when it comes, I'll be ready. We've been best friends since high school, the kind of bond that felt unbreakable. He was my partner in crime, the one I could always rely on, the person who knew every ridiculous quirk and embarrassing detail about me. We joked that we were basically siblings, just without the actual family ties. I'd tell him about my latest crushes, and he'd laugh, rolling his eyes while pretending to take notes. If anyone had ever suggested we'd end up together, we'd have laughed them out of the room. But life, as I learned, has a strange sense of humor. One winter night, things took an unexpected turn. We'd both just gotten out of relationships, so we spent the evening venting, working our way through a bottle of whiskey, determined to drown out any trace of heartache. By the time the bottle was empty, we were sprawled on his living room floor, laughing about nothing, about everything. And then, in a moment that felt surreal, we just looked at each other, both of us suddenly quiet. "Have you ever thought about us?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. I laughed, brushing it off as a joke, but he didn't look away. I tried to say something witty, but the words tangled in my throat, and suddenly, he was leaning closer, his hand resting gently on my cheek. The kiss happened so naturally that it felt inevitable, as if we'd both been waiting for it without knowing. The next morning was a whirlwind of confusion. We both sat there, sipping coffee in an awkward silence, as if the previous night had been a fever dream. He was the first to break it, scratching the back of his neck like he always did when he was nervous. "Last night, that was, unexpected," he said with a small, hesitant smile. I agreed, laughing it off, but I could feel a strange flutter in my chest, something I didn't want to acknowledge. We promised to forget it ever happened, swearing it would just be an amusing story between us. But, of course, forgetting wasn't that easy. The weeks that followed were a mess of mixed signals and uncomfortable tension. We tried to hang out like before, only for one of us to bring up that night as a joke, trying to defuse the awkwardness. Our friends noticed, too, giving us questioning looks, as if sensing the shift but not quite sure what it meant. One night, a few months later, I met someone new, a sweet guy who seemed genuinely interested in me. I decided to go for it, thinking it was what I needed to clear my head. I casually mentioned my new guy to my friend, watching his reaction closely. He smiled, of course, told me I deserved someone amazing. But as he said it, there was this flicker of something in his eyes. Pain, jealousy, I couldn't tell. For a brief second, I thought he might say something, but instead he changed the subject, talking about a movie he wanted us to see. As I started dating this new guy, things with my best friend grew more strained. We'd still text and hang out, but he'd grown distant, retreating in ways I didn't fully understand. I found myself missing him, missing us. I wanted to talk to him about it, but every time I tried, he'd brush me off, telling me he was just busy or tired. I began to wonder if maybe I'd ruined the one thing that had been solid in my life. After a few weeks of barely speaking, I decided to confront him. I invited him over under the pretense of catching up, and when he arrived, he looked as nervous as I felt. We sat on my sofa, both of us avoiding each other's gaze, until finally, I took a deep breath and just blurted it out. "Do you miss how we used to be?" He looked up, startled, and for a moment he didn't say anything. Then, almost in a whisper, he admitted, "Yeah, I do." There was a pause, and then he added, "I think I just didn't know how to deal with us." That night, my heart skipped a beat, and suddenly, everything I'd been ignoring came rushing to the surface. "I don't want to lose you," I said quietly, barely able to meet his eyes. He nodded, his expression softening, and before I could think, he reached over, his hand covering mine. We sat there in silence, both of us realizing how close we'd come to letting something slip away. That night, we decided to give it a shot. No big declarations, no promises of forever, just the understanding that maybe this was worth exploring, worth the risk. It was strange, thrilling, terrifying. Some days we'd laugh about it, marveling at how blind we'd been for so long. Other days, it felt almost too fragile, like a single misstep could shatter everything. As the months went by, we settled into something that felt right. There were still moments of awkwardness, little doubts and fears that cropped up, but they were outweighed by this newfound closeness, this ease that came from years of friendship. He became my person in a way he hadn't been before, someone I could share everything with, not just as a friend, but as something more. Today, we're together, still figuring it out as we go. It's not a fairy tale. It's messy, imperfect, sometimes a little too real. But it's ours. And every so often, we'll look at each other, and one of us will say, "Can you believe it took us this long?" Then we'll laugh, grateful for the twist we never saw coming. for the friendship that became something we never dared to dream about. He was my best friend from high school, the kind of friendship built on years of inside jokes, marathon phone calls, and knowing each other's families like our own. We never once crossed the line. It was almost an unspoken rule. Everyone always asked if we'd ever be more, and we'd just roll our eyes. I dated other people. He did too, and we'd swap stories, always cheering each other on. He was the one person I trusted more than anyone else, my safe place. Years passed, and we drifted in and out of each other's lives as life pulled us in different directions. College, new jobs, different cities. We'd still catch up every few months, though, picking up right where we left off, like no time had passed. But then last year, I moved back to our hometown, and suddenly, he was a regular part of my life again. We fell into our old rhythm, going to our favorite spots, cooking dinner together, just hanging out. It felt like coming home. One night, after a particularly rough week, he invited me over to unwind. We opened a bottle of wine, laughing at how we'd once thought wine tasted terrible back in high school. We ended up on his old couch, talking about everything we'd missed in each other's lives over the years, our voices softening as the night grew late. Somewhere in that cozy quiet, he looked at me with this expression I hadn't seen before, something almost vulnerable. "What if," he started, then trailed off, his eyes dropping to his glass. I waited, heart pounding, but he didn't finish. Instead, he laughed it off and put on a movie, like he hadn't just almost cracked open some door between us. I pretended I hadn't noticed, but the tension between us was suddenly thick enough to cut. 2 weeks went by after that night, and neither of us brought it up. I kept telling myself I was imagining things, that I was just reading too much into an innocent look. Then one Friday, we decided to hit up a bar with some mutual friends. We had a few drinks, and for some reason, the way he was laughing, the way he'd nudge my shoulder every now and then, it all felt different. I'd known him my whole life, but it was like I was seeing him for the first time. Later, while we were all dancing, he pulled me aside and asked if I wanted to go for a walk. I said yes, without a second thought. We ended up at the park by our old high school, sitting on the swings like we had as teenagers. We were both quiet, the kind of silence that feels loaded, full of everything you're too afraid to say. Then, out of nowhere, he reached over, took my hand, and just held it, his thumb tracing circles on my palm. "What are we doing?" I whispered, almost to myself. He looked at me, eyes soft and uncertain, and said, "I don't know. But I think I wanted to do this for a long time." And just like that, he leaned in, his lips brushing mine so gently it felt like a question, one I answered without hesitation. That kiss felt like coming home, like finding something I hadn't realized I'd been looking for. The days after were surreal. We didn't tell anyone, didn't even talk about it much ourselves. We just kept seeing each other, almost like nothing had changed. But there were stolen kisses now, secret smiles across the table, and the thrill of something new woven into the familiarity we'd always shared. We didn't define it. We didn't feel the need to. It was like we both understood that whatever this was, it was worth exploring, even if it meant risking everything we'd built over the years. As the weeks went on, we became inseparable. Friends started noticing, dropping little comments, giving us these knowing smiles. We'd laugh it off, not ready to confirm anything to the world just yet. But deep down, I knew this was something real, something I couldn't walk away from even if I tried. Then, one night, he invited me to his family's big Sunday dinner. I'd been to countless family dinners with him over the years, but this time, it felt monumental. We sat close, holding hands under the table, and his mom kept giving me this look like she'd known this was coming long before either of us did. That night, when everyone had left, he told me he loved me. Simple, straightforward, without any fanfare, just 3 words that felt like a quiet promise. I said it back, and everything just fell into place. It's been almost a year now. We're still best friends, but now there's something deeper, something steadier that wasn't there before. We know each other's histories, all the messy bits, the heartbreaks, the dreams, the fears. But now we're building something new, something just for us. People still ask if we ever imagined we'd end up together, and we just laugh because the answer is no. But sometimes, life gives you something you didn't know you wanted. And now, I can't imagine my life any other way. Junior year, we had this substitute teacher for math who was, to put it mildly, kind of a legend. Mr. Carter had a reputation for either not noticing or not caring about anything that went down in his classes. He'd stroll in, write some problems on the board, and then sit down with his coffee, totally oblivious. Naturally, we saw this as an open invitation to turn the classroom into a circus every time he showed up. One day, my friend Nick decided it was time to test just how far Mr. Carter's indifference went. So mid-lecture, Nick pulled out this remote-controlled car he'd been showing off for days. It was this tiny, souped-up monster truck that could climb over anything, and Nick was determined to make it the star of the show. He placed it on the floor and started zipping it around the desks, weaving in and out of everyone's feet like it was an obstacle course. We all held our breath, half waiting for Mr. Carter to notice and lose it, but he just kept scribbling on the board, completely unfazed. The car zoomed over to the front of the room, bumping right into Mr. Carter's desk, and still, nothing. By now, the entire class was giggling, covering our mouths to muffle the laughter, but Mr. Carter didn't even look up. Nick took it as a green light and started sending the car over to people's feet, pretending to attack them with mini drive-bys. Finally, someone dared him to make the car do donuts around Mr. Carter's chair, just to see if he'd react. So Nick maneuvered it, circling Mr. Carter's chair, while we all watched, wide-eyed, waiting for the explosion. But instead, Mr. Carter simply glanced down at the car as if it were just another part of the furniture, mumbled something to himself, and continued teaching like nothing weird was happening at all. At that point, the entire class was in silent hysterics, watching this scene unfold. We thought Mr. Carter was some kind of Jedi master of ignoring chaos, until Nick decided to take things up a notch. In one final act of boldness, Nick drove the car directly onto Mr. Carter's shoe. The little truck got stuck, whirring its wheels in place, but this time Mr. Carter finally looked down. For a second, he just stared at the car on his shoe, as if he wasn't quite sure what he was seeing. Then, in the most casual way possible, he lifted his foot, tipped the car off, and nudged it back toward Nick, who looked like he was about to have a heart attack from laughing so hard. Without a word, Mr. Carter turned back to the board and continued his lesson as if nothing had happened. After class, we all scrambled out, still laughing about the whole scene, convinced that nothing could top the stoic powers of Mr. Carter. But then the next day, we found out that Nick's little stunt had, in fact, caught his attention. Right before lunch, they called Nick to the office, and he came back with a grin so wide we knew something legendary had gone down. Apparently, Mr. Carter hadn't been as oblivious as he'd seemed. When the principal asked if Mr. Carter wanted Nick punished for the disruption, Mr. Carter had just shrugged and said, "That was the best part of my week. Just tell him to keep it under control next time." It became a school legend. This story of the unbreakable Mr. Carter and the day Nick's little remote car finally got a reaction. To this day, I think Mr. Carter might have been the coolest teacher we ever had, strictly because he didn't care if we turned his classroom into a playground, as long as we left him and his coffee alone. I never thought I'd end up making a living off of plants. Not the kind you see in a big garden center or the beautiful landscapes around city parks, but just plain old, everyday houseplants. Ferns, succulents, a few hardy cacti, that sort of thing. Yet somehow, over the past couple of years, these leafy little guys have completely transformed my life. It started as a way to unwind. A couple of years ago, I went through a messy breakup, and as part of my post-breakup healing, I found myself wandering around a garden store. I didn't go in with a plan, but there was this scraggly little cactus sitting on a back shelf, all alone, like no one wanted it. I guess I related to that cactus more than I realized because I bought it on impulse and took it home. I set it on my windowsill and named it Spike. I'd read somewhere that talking to plants helps them grow, so I'd give it pep talks whenever I passed by, which felt oddly therapeutic. Spike, as it turned out, was just the beginning. The next week, I bought a small fern and a pothos plant. Then, on a Saturday trip to the farmer's market, I found myself coming home with 3 succulents I didn't remember deciding to buy. Before long, my apartment was slowly transforming into a mini jungle, and I actually loved it. I felt calmer surrounded by green. and tending to my plants became a way to clear my mind. Watering, trimming, making sure they got enough light. It was a simple routine, but it helped me feel grounded. Then, one day, a friend came over and joked that my place looked like a little rainforest. She pointed out that I had an unusual number of plants for someone with a small city apartment. She even started calling me Plant Mom, which we both laughed about, but then she paused and said, "Actually, you should do something with this. Not everyone has a green thumb like you." I laughed it off at first, but later that night, I thought, what if I did something with this? I'd been in my job for a few years and felt uninspired, stuck. I didn't want to dive into something completely new, but I also didn't want to ignore how happy caring for plants made me. So, as a small experiment, I created an Instagram account called The Plant Mom Chronicles, where I posted simple tips about houseplants. Things like how to keep succulents alive, the best plants for beginners, or how to make a small space feel greener. Much to my surprise, people actually started following along. Within a few weeks, I had a small community of fellow plant lovers, many of whom would comment or message me with questions. Soon, my inbox was filled with photos of sad-looking plants with questions like, "Can this be saved?" or "Why is my fern turning brown?" It was hilarious, in a way. I'd never considered myself a plant expert, but I suddenly found myself staying up late researching answers and doing deep dives into plant care websites to help people bring their greenery back to life. As my following grew, I decided to take a risk. I offered a houseplant rescue service. For a small fee, people could book an appointment, and I'd come over, assess their plants, and give advice on how to revive them. At first, I thought maybe 2 or 3 people might be interested, but within a week, I was fully booked. My weekends quickly turned into houseplant triage, where I'd go from apartment to apartment diagnosing root rot, repotting sad philodendrons, and helping people understand the basics of plant care. It was incredible. Each visit felt like a mini adventure, meeting new people and bonding over our shared plant struggles. Some people had huge floor-to-ceiling windows and didn't know what to do with the light, while others lived in dark basement apartments and wanted to know if anything could survive with just a little artificial light. I felt like a plant detective, solving little mysteries one visit at a time. Then, one Saturday, I met a young couple with a particularly challenging situation. They had a housewarming gift, a gorgeous fiddle leaf fig tree, that was dying slowly but surely, even though they'd tried everything. I spent almost an hour examining the plant, adjusting its position in the room, and teaching them how to care for it. They watched every move, genuinely invested, and by the end of the appointment, they were gushing with gratitude, even giving me a hug. That night, I got a message from them, along with a photo of their revived plant and a short note. "You really saved our plant, but more importantly, you saved a little piece of our home. Thank you." That was when I realized I'd stumbled into something meaningful. I wasn't just helping people keep plants alive. I was helping them create spaces that felt alive. As my houseplant rescue service grew, I decided to branch out a bit. I started hosting small workshops at local coffee shops on how not to kill your houseplant, where I'd bring a few plants and teach people the basics of plant care over coffee and pastries. These workshops quickly filled up, and I was astonished at how many people shared my newfound love for these quiet green companions. People came back each month bringing friends or new questions, and eventually, a small community formed around these gatherings. Then one evening, after a particularly packed workshop, the owner of the coffee shop approached me. She asked if I'd be interested in creating a few plant displays for her shop, something cozy and green to bring life to the seating areas. I spent the next week carefully choosing plants, arranging them on shelves and tables, and even hanging a few small ones from the ceiling to create a natural canopy effect. The transformation was incredible. It made the space feel alive like a little urban oasis. From there, word spread. Local shops, offices, and even a few restaurants started reaching out, asking if I could bring plants into their spaces. I found myself creating these custom green makeovers, turning blank walls into lush displays of greenery and transforming workspaces into calming, plant-filled retreats. It was more work than I ever expected, but it was also thrilling. People weren't just buying plants. They were investing in the feeling plants brought to their spaces. Fast forward to today, and what started as a way to pass the time has turned into my full-time business, which I officially named Urban Green. I design plant installations, host workshops, and offer in-home consultations for people who want to add a bit of nature to their lives. I even sell plant rescue kits, which include tools, instructions, and everything people need to save their struggling plants. Looking back, it's almost funny how a tiny cactus sparked this whole journey. I never imagined that one lonely plant could bring me so much purpose, or that there were so many people out there just waiting for someone to help them create a connection with nature. But here I am, the self-proclaimed plant mom, turning empty spaces into green, thriving oases. Now, every time I see someone buying their first plant, I smile, wondering if they realize they're about to embark on something bigger than they expected. Because if I've learned anything, it's that sometimes a small bit of green can grow into something life-changing. And if that's not a little bit of magic, I don't know what is. I was 20, back home for the summer after a year away at college. I'd reconnected with my high school friends, and we spent the nights drinking around bonfires, talking like we hadn't just spent a year apart. My closest friend Jake still lived with his parents, and his mom, Lisa, was one of those people who made everyone feel at home. She'd bring out snacks, join us sometimes, and somehow knew all the drama without ever prying. One night, a huge storm hit, and it was just me and Jake holed up at his place. His mom was home alone since his dad was out of town, and she asked if I'd mind helping her bring in some things from the yard. When we came back in, drenched, Jake went off to shower and left me in the kitchen with Lisa. I made some lame joke about how I was practically living there that summer, and she laughed, pushing a wet strand of hair behind her ear. Something in her expression softened, and suddenly, the air felt different. "Can I tell you something?" she said, her voice low. I nodded, unsure. She said she'd been feeling lonely, that things had been tough with Jake's dad. She started talking about how she felt trapped, how she missed feeling desired. I listened, unsure of what to say, feeling a strange sympathy mixed with something else. A curiosity, maybe? I wasn't really sure, but I was drawn in. I don't know what came over me, but when she put her hand on my arm, I didn't pull away. Her touch lingered, a quiet moment that built into something neither of us had planned. When she kissed me, it was gentle, almost like she was afraid to break the moment, but then we were tangled together right there in the kitchen. By the time Jake came back, we were sitting apart but still catching our breath, trying to act like nothing had happened. After that, we started meeting in secret. She'd find excuses to send Jake out for errands, or wait until he left to work his summer job. Each time, I told myself it would be the last, but it never was. It was thrilling and forbidden, and I was in way over my head, but every time I saw her, I couldn't help myself. Eventually, though, it all unraveled. One night, Jake got back earlier than expected and found us in the living room. I'll never forget the look on his face, a mix of confusion, betrayal, and disgust. He didn't even say anything to me. He just looked at his mom and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the pictures on the wall shook. The fallout was ugly. Jake and I stopped talking completely. Lisa tried to patch things up with him, but he couldn't look at either of us. His dad found out eventually, too, and the tension around town was unbearable. I left for college in the fall and didn't come back much after that. Lisa and her husband separated the next year, and Jake and I never spoke again. Now, every time I visit home, I pass by their house with a sense of regret. I lost my best friend and fractured his family over something that should never have happened, but it's a chapter I'll never escape, no matter how far away I go. I wasn't planning on going out that night. It had been a week of long hours and late meetings, and my only goal was to sink into my couch and let the exhaustion settle in. But then my friend Jess called, her voice buzzing with excitement, insisting that I join her at a bar where everyone was apparently going to be. She knew I didn't need much convincing. Half an hour later, I was dressed and out the door, feeling the familiar mix of reluctance and anticipation that always came with last-minute plans. When I arrived, the place was packed. It was one of those bars with low lighting, loud music, and the perpetual smell of craft cocktails in the air. Jess spotted me immediately, dragging me to the group she was with, introducing me to faces I barely registered in the noise. I grabbed a drink, trying to ease into the atmosphere, but I felt out of place, my exhaustion creeping back. And then, there he was, leaning against the bar with a drink in hand, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. There was something about him that caught my eye, Maybe it was the slight smirk or the way he seemed as unimpressed with the scene as I was. He glanced over, caught me watching, and raised an eyebrow, as if to say, "You too?" I shrugged back, feeling an unexpected spark of amusement. He made his way over, a slow, unhurried approach that felt refreshing in a room full of loud, quick gestures. He introduced himself as Max, and before I knew it, we were deep in conversation, trading sarcastic observations about the people around us. He had a wit that was sharp but easygoing, and it felt like we were both in on some private joke no one else could understand. I felt myself relaxing, the weariness fading with each laugh we shared. At some point, he offered to get me another drink, and I realized I'd been talking to him for over an hour without even noticing the time. We drifted toward a quieter corner, away from the crowd, and the conversation shifted from playful banter to something a bit deeper. He asked me about my job, my interests, and as I spoke, I found myself sharing more than I usually would with a stranger. It was as if he had this knack for drawing out pieces of me I hadn't even realized were there, bits I usually kept to myself. Eventually, we moved to the outdoor patio, where the cool night air felt like a relief from the crowded bar. We talked about everything and nothing. Our favorite books, our least favorite cities, dreams we'd had as kids that never quite faded. It was surreal, the way it felt like we'd known each other for longer than just a couple of hours. Then, in a quiet moment, he looked at me with a softness that made my heart race. I wasn't even sure who leaned in first, but before I knew it, we were kissing, slow and unhurried, like we had all the time in the world. It felt both thrilling and oddly comforting, as if we'd somehow slipped into a universe where nothing else mattered. We ended up back at his place, a cozy, unassuming apartment that felt warm and lived in. The night blurred into a mix of laughter, whispered confessions, and shared warmth, and for those hours, it was like we were the only two people in the world. It was both electric and grounding, a strange mix of passion and comfort that felt new and familiar all at once. The next morning, I woke up to find him already awake, leaning against the windowsill, staring out into the city with a cup of coffee. He turned and gave me a small, sleepy smile that made me feel oddly shy. For a moment, I let myself imagine what it would be like if this was something more than a single night. But then reality set in, reminding me that magic like this rarely survived beyond the dawn. He offered me coffee, and we sat on his couch, talking about everything except what might come next. There was a shared understanding, an unspoken agreement that this was a beautiful, fleeting thing. When it was time to go, he walked me to the door, his hand lingering on mine for just a second longer than necessary, like he was holding on to the last bit of the night. As I left, a strange mix of satisfaction and melancholy settled over me. I knew that night had been special, something rare, but I also knew it was already slipping into a memory, one of those stories you look back on and wonder if it was real. On the cab ride home, I felt the weight of it, the thrill, the intimacy, the brief connection that had felt both complete and unfinished. In the days that followed, I found myself replaying the night in my mind, the feeling of being truly seen, if only for a little while. I realized that as much as I'd loved the excitement of it, there was a part of me that longed for something deeper, something that didn't end with a goodbye at dawn. That night with Max taught me something important. As thrilling as these moments are, they're not enough for me anymore. I want more than fleeting connections and stories that fade with the morning light. I want someone who stays, someone who could be there not just for the highs, but for the quiet, everyday moments too. I'm still grateful for that night though. It was a reminder of what it feels like to connect, to let my guard down, to trust. And maybe someday I'll find that again in a way that lasts. Until then, I'll hold on to the memory of that perfect, brief night with Max, a little bit of magic I'll always carry with me. The wind off the water was sharp, biting at my cheeks as I sat on the old bench overlooking the harbor. I hadn't been back in my hometown for years, not since I'd left right after college, eager to shake off the dust of small-town life and dive headfirst into the city. Yet somehow, here I was, wrapped in a coat that didn't feel nearly warm enough, watching the waves roll in under a gray November sky. The email had come 2 days earlier, a short, awkward note from Hannah, my high school girlfriend. We hadn't spoken in over a decade. My dad's memorial is this weekend. I thought you might want to come. That was it. No pleasantries, no catching up, just the bare facts, as if to remind me that this wasn't a social invitation. Her dad, Mr. Miller, had been a kind of surrogate father to me growing up. He was the coach of our soccer team, the one who'd taken me on fishing trips, given me my first beer, and taught me how to drive. He'd been there for every important moment in my life back then, and it seemed impossible to imagine him as anything but that strong, steady presence. But now, he was gone, and somehow, Hannah had reached out to me. I couldn't bring myself to ignore it. The town looked almost exactly as I'd left it, a snapshot frozen in time. The same shops lined the main street, their signs worn and faded, and the old diner still had the best burgers in town sign hanging crooked above the door. There was a strange comfort in it, like stepping back into a familiar dream. I arrived at the church a few minutes early, pulling into a spot at the edge of the lot. As I climbed out of the car, I caught sight of Hannah standing near the entrance, talking to someone I vaguely recognized from high school. She looked different, older, of course, but more than that. There was a weariness in her posture, a gravity I didn't remember. When she saw me, she excused herself and walked over, her face lighting up in a faint smile. "You made it," she said softly, her voice carrying a note of surprise. "Yeah," I replied, feeling suddenly awkward. I got your email." "Thanks for coming," she said, her gaze dropping to the ground. "I wasn't sure if you would." We stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of all the years and memories stretching between us. I wanted to say something, anything, to fill the quiet, but the words felt heavy, tangled in the past. The service was short, a quiet, solemn tribute to a man who had meant so much to so many people. The pews were filled with familiar faces, people who had known Mr. Miller, who had grown up under his watchful eye, much like I had. I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name, a mix of loss and nostalgia, a reminder of all the things I'd left behind. After the service, as people drifted out of the church, Hannah came up to me, her expression unreadable. "Do you have a little time?" she asked. "There's something I'd like to show you." "Of course," I said, nodding. We drove in silence, winding through streets that brought back flashes of memory. Nights spent sneaking out, lazy summer afternoons, the two of us driving with nowhere to go. She turned onto a familiar road, one that led down to the lake where we'd spent so much of our time together. The lake was exactly as I remembered it, a vast, calm expanse stretching out beneath the overcast sky. The wind whipped through the reeds along the shore, carrying with it the sharp, clean scent of the water. We parked, and I followed her down the narrow path that led to the old dock, the one we'd claimed as our own years ago. As we reached the edge of the dock, she stopped, looking out over the water, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "He brought me here the week before he died," she said quietly. "He was so weak, but he insisted. Said he wanted to sit here one last time." I nodded, the memory of him, strong and smiling, clashing with the image she was painting. It was hard to reconcile the two, to picture him as anything other than the solid, unwavering figure he'd been. Hannah took a deep breath, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "He told me a story that day. About you." "Me?" I asked, caught off guard. She nodded, her eyes meeting mine. "He said you came to him the night before you left for college. Said you were worried about leaving everything behind. About leaving me behind." I swallowed, the memory rushing back to me. I'd been 18, scared and uncertain, wondering if I was making the right choice, if leaving was really what I wanted. I'd gone to him that night, hoping for some kind of reassurance, a sign that it would all be okay. "He told me that you asked him if it was worth it," she continued, her voice soft. "If leaving was worth the risk of losing everything you loved." I remembered his words, so clear it was as if he were standing beside me again. "Sometimes you have to let go to find out what you really want. And if it's meant to be, it'll be here, waiting for you." "He said he believed in you," Hannah went on, her voice trembling slightly. "He told me he always knew you'd do great things." A lump formed in my throat, the weight of his words settling over me. I hadn't thought about that night in years, hadn't let myself remember the uncertainty, the fear, the longing I'd buried so deep. I looked at Hannah, seeing the hurt in her eyes, the echoes of all the things we'd left unsaid. "I never wanted to hurt you," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. Leaving was it felt like something I had to do. "But I missed you, Hannah, more than I can say." She nodded, a sad smile tugging at her lips. "I know, I missed you too. But life went on, didn't it?" We stood there, side by side, the lake stretching out before us, the memories swirling around us like ghosts. The air was heavy with unspoken words, with regrets and what-ifs, with the quiet understanding that sometimes life doesn't turn out the way you expect. After a long silence, she turned to me, her gaze steady. "Do you want to come back to the house? I made too much food, and I could use the company." I hesitated, feeling the weight of everything that had passed between us. All the years, the miles, the choices. But as I looked at her, at the girl I'd once loved and the woman she'd become, I felt a strange, tentative hope flicker to life. "I'd like that," I said, my voice soft, almost shy. Back at the house, we sat in the kitchen, sharing a quiet meal, the air filled with the soft hum of old appliances and the warmth of familiar comforts. We talked about small things, work, old friends, the weather. It was nothing like the deep, heart-to-heart conversations we'd once had, but it felt right, like easing into something fragile, something that needed care. As the evening wore on, I found myself glancing around the room, noticing all the little touches that had been Mr. Miller's. A well-worn baseball cap hanging on the coat rack, a set of fishing poles propped against the wall, the old radio he'd always kept tuned to his favorite jazz station. I felt his presence there, a gentle, comforting warmth that seemed to fill every corner of the house. Hannah caught me looking and smiled. "He'd have liked seeing you here again," she said quietly. "You were like a son to him, you know." I swallowed, the lump in my throat returning. He was like a father to me too. We stayed up late, talking about everything and nothing, the hours slipping away like leaves on the water. At some point, she poured us each a glass of wine, and we found ourselves on the back porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the stars flicker against the vast, inky sky. As the night deepened, she leaned her head against my shoulder, a quiet, fragile gesture that felt like a bridge between our past and the uncertain future stretching out before us. "I'm glad you came," she murmured, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Me too," I replied, feeling the truth of it settle deep in my bones. And in that moment, with the weight of the past behind us and the quiet promise of something new before us, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. Maybe we couldn't go back, couldn't undo the choices we'd made, the paths we'd taken. But as we sat there, side by side, under the endless, star-strewn sky, I realized that sometimes, finding your way back to where you started can be the beginning of something else entirely. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. My friend Lauren has a story about her job that's turned into something of a legend in our group. She worked in customer service for a major airline for a few years, but this wasn't just your run-of-the-mill phone support. Lauren was part of a specialized team that dealt with VIP travelers, high-profile clients who paid extra for concierge-level service. Think celebrities, CEOs, and the type of people who demand a private jet but settle for first class on commercial flights. Her job was to handle their every request, no matter how ridiculous, with a smile. One day, she gets a call from an assistant to one of these VIPs, who she can't name for confidentiality reasons, but let's just say it's someone with a household name. The assistant is in full panic mode because their boss is flying across the country the next day, and they've realized, only last minute, that they need an entire row blocked off just for him. No one sitting next to him, and ideally no one within earshot. To add to the madness, the boss wanted the airline to arrange his meals, not just for the flight, but also for his 3-day stay in the next city. They wanted his favorite type of water chilled to a precise temperature waiting at every layover. And if that wasn't enough, they requested blackout curtains installed around his first-class seat for complete privacy. The assistant also suggested that the airline consider hiring additional security for the journey, as if they could just pick up a few extra guards at the gate. Lauren, with her nothing surprises me demeanor, politely explains what's possible and what isn't. She even tries to accommodate some of these wild demands, coordinating with catering, moving around seat assignments, and calling the flight crew to alert them of the special passenger. The day of the flight, everything seems set. Lauren has bent over backward, made countless calls, rearranged half the seating chart, and even managed to get his favorite sparkling water in stock. Fast forward to the flight's departure. Lauren gets a notification that the VIP is boarded, and she's breathing a sigh of relief when her phone rings. It's one of the flight attendants, whispering urgently. Apparently, the VIP was furious when he realized that his blackout curtains were just a pair of flimsy eye masks tucked into his seat pocket. He was irate that they hadn't installed an actual set of curtains around his seat, as if this was a luxury hotel suite rather than a commercial airplane. According to the flight attendant, he was threatening to leave the plane until they could fix it, as if they could just whip out a drill and hammer mid-boarding. Lauren tries to calm the situation, suggesting the VIP close the window shades and wear noise-canceling headphones for optimal privacy. Eventually, after some soothing words and a comped glass of champagne, he settles down. But she can hear the exasperation in the attendant's voice, who is doing everything possible not to roll her eyes at his absurd demands. After the flight, Lauren hopes that's the end of it. But no, she receives a scathing email from the VIP's assistant the next morning listing unacceptable failures of the concierge service. It includes everything from the absence of blackout curtains to the fact that his water was barely chilled and not the exact brand specified. Lauren spent the next week dealing with back-and-forth emails, every message getting more nitpicky and entitled than the last, and each complaint thinner than the one before it. At one point, they even blamed her for the flight's turbulence, as if she could somehow control the weather. By the end of the ordeal, Lauren had a new personal motto: some people have too much money and too little self-awareness. She stayed at the job a bit longer, but swore off any VIP roles after that. Now, every time someone in our friend group starts complaining about a frustrating customer, Lauren just smirks and says, "Try getting blamed for turbulence, and then we'll talk." It was late, and I was exhausted from a long day, waiting at a nearly empty subway platform with only the hum of the tracks for company. I was scrolling through my phone, barely paying attention, when I heard someone muttering nearby. I glanced up to see a guy pacing the platform, looking intensely at a piece of paper in his hand. He was frowning, and every few steps he muttered, "That can't be right." I tried to look away, but he caught my gaze, clearly frustrated. "Sorry," he said, holding up the paper with a sheepish grin. "I think I've just committed a major crime against poetry. Mind if I ask you a quick question?" Caught off guard, I shrugged. "Sure, hit me." He waved the crumpled paper. "All right, real talk. Does moonlight rhyme with goodnight? Or am I losing it?" I stifled a laugh. "I think you're safe with that one. It's close enough." He let out a dramatic sigh of relief, as if I'd just saved him from literary disaster. "Thank you. I've been working on this piece for a poetry class, and I was this close to throwing it on the subway tracks and letting it fend for itself." "Poetry on the subway tracks," I mused. "Now that's poetic." He grinned. "Maybe it'll get published posthumously. The Lost Poems of the 4th Avenue Station." His casual humor made me laugh, and he looked oddly proud of himself. I half expected him to walk away, but he lingered, holding the paper out to me. "Would you maybe want to read it? I mean, since you're now my official rhyme consultant." I took the paper, trying to hide my curiosity, and read through his poem. It was surprisingly good, a little rough but sincere, with lines about wandering the city at night, feeling lost and strangely alive. I handed it back to him, smiling. "Not bad, poet of the 4th Avenue Station." He laughed, and there was a pause, a quiet moment that felt oddly comfortable. "I'm Liam, by the way," he said, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Nice to meet you, Liam. I'm Sara." Our train pulled up, and we boarded together, still talking. We found seats across from each other, and he launched into the story of how he'd ended up in the poetry class on a dare from his roommates. "They didn't think I'd actually stick with it," he admitted. "But now, I kind of like it. Weird, right?" "Not weird at all," I said, feeling unexpectedly drawn to his mix of humor and honesty. We ended up discussing everything from favorite poets to terrible writing assignments, and before I knew it, the train was nearing my stop. As it slowed down, I stood up, feeling a pang of disappointment. "Well, this is me." He looked up a little uncertain. "Do you think maybe we could grab coffee sometime? To talk rhymes and such. Maybe help me avoid more poetic crimes." I grinned, handing him my phone. "All right, but only if you promise to let me read your next poem." He took my number, then looked up, holding my gaze with a smile that made my heart skip. "Deal, Sarah. Prepare yourself for more questionable rhymes." I stepped off the train, watching as it pulled away, and I realized I was smiling. The night felt a little less empty, the city a little more alive. My buddy Tom has this story that's infamous among his friends. He was working as a junior analyst at a big financial firm right out of college, and he'd finally gotten assigned to a real project, a merger between two mid-sized companies. It was his chance to prove himself, and he was ready to go all in. His team handed him a massive stack of documents, spreadsheets, forecasts, all the typical corporate numbers soup, and told him they needed a deep dive analysis. He was excited and nervous, so he basically moved into his cubicle for the next 2 weeks, staying late every night and coming in on weekends. But here's the thing. No one had really briefed him on the companies involved or why the merger was happening. He was just supposed to crank out numbers, so that's exactly what he did. He noticed some discrepancies in the balance sheets, weird stuff that didn't quite add up. At first, he thought maybe he was just missing something. But the more he dug, the stranger it got. He found one company had a bunch of shell corporations funneling money around, and there was this odd pattern of loan write-offs that looked, to him, suspiciously like they were hiding losses. Tom took his concerns to his manager, who brushed him off, saying, "We're just here to make sure the numbers look right for the board. Let them deal with the details." That didn't sit well with him, but he told himself it was above his pay grade and kept going. The night before the report was due, Tom was in the office alone, putting together his final analysis. Suddenly, he gets a call from the CFO. The CFO, a guy who never interacted with junior staff, wanted Tom to come up for a quick chat. It sounded casual, but Tom was sweating. He thought he'd done something wrong, missed a decimal or something. When he walked into the office, the CFO was sitting there with his arms crossed, and the most intense look Tom had ever seen. Without even saying hello, he asked, "Are you sure about your numbers?" Tom nodded, explaining that he'd double-checked everything. The CFO didn't look pleased. He leaned in and said, "Here's what you're going to do. I want you to adjust certain figures. Let's say, make things more palatable." He actually used the word palatable. Tom's stomach dropped. He was being asked to doctor the report. Tom tried to object, mumbling something about professional standards, but the CFO just cut him off, saying, "Do you want a future here? Because if you do, you'll understand that this is how things get done." It was an unspoken threat, plain as day. Tom felt his career, his whole future in finance, hanging by a thread in that moment. In a daze, he went back to his desk. He stared at his computer, hands hovering over the keyboard, debating what to do. Then out of nowhere, he had this crazy idea. He sent the original, unaltered report to himself from his work email, figuring he'd at least have a record of what he'd found. Then he made the adjustments the CFO had asked for, turned in the edited version, and tried not to think too hard about it. A few months later, news broke that the merged company was going under. Investors were furious, and it turned into a scandal that got splashed all over the financial press. People lost millions, and the CFO quietly resigned amid the backlash. Tom kept his head down, but he could see that a storm was brewing. Eventually, an internal investigation started, and out of nowhere, he was called in for questioning. He could hardly believe it, but the investigators were interested in his original report. Somehow, they found his email trail, the one he'd sent to himself. Turns out, that email saved his career. His unaltered report showed he'd been honest, and he came out of the scandal not only unscathed, but even a little heroic among his peers. The firm took a hit, but Tom's reputation was solid. He left finance not long after that, saying he'd rather be broke than get stuck in an industry where palatable numbers were the norm. These days, he does consulting work for small businesses, and he always ends his story with a laugh and a bit of advice. Never trust a report that looks too perfect. There's a good chance someone's been adjusting. I didn't set out to change my life that day. In fact, I almost didn't leave the house at all. It was a gray Saturday, drizzling just enough to feel like an excuse to stay in bed with Netflix and delivery tacos. I had no grand plans, just laundry, maybe a quick trip to the grocery store. Nothing that would have marked the day as different from any other weekend in my busy but fairly ordinary life. But there was a nagging thought in my mind, a reminder of an old bookshop I hadn't visited in years. Eliot's Rare Finds. It was the kind of place you'd never spot if you didn't know it was there, wedged between two narrow buildings on a side street. I'd stumbled on it by accident in college and returned a few times after, but not recently. Still, something about it lingered in my memory that day, almost like it was calling to me. So, on a whim, I grabbed my coat, turned off the half-finished TV show, and headed out into the rain. The shop hadn't changed. It was as dimly lit and dusty as ever, filled with that familiar, comforting smell of old pages and wood polish. The owner, an elderly man with round glasses and a face that seemed older than time, nodded at me with a vague sense of recognition. I wandered around, browsing shelves of worn hardcovers and stacked paperbacks, pulling random books and reading first lines as if searching for something that would tell me why I felt compelled to come here. And then, in the farthest corner of the shop, I found a strange, thin book with no title on the spine. The cover was dark and worn, and when I opened it, I saw that it was handwritten, as if someone had copied it out by hand. The first page simply said, "Instructions for a Life." Intrigued, I flipped to the first entry, which read, "Take a different way home, and look for something beautiful along the way." I closed the book, feeling the words settle in my mind. I didn't know what I was expecting, but somehow, it felt personal, as if the book was speaking directly to me. I checked the price, handed over a few crumpled bills to the owner, and walked out with it tucked under my arm. As I left the store, I thought about that first instruction. I was already out of my usual orbit, so why not follow the advice? I decided to walk home, even though it was a bit of a trek, especially in the rain. I took turns down streets I'd never noticed before, looking for something beautiful, just as the book suggested. I found it in the least likely of places, a tiny urban garden wedged between two buildings, hidden from the street. There were roses, wild and tangled, growing through a wrought iron fence, their petals beaded with rain. I stood there for a moment, just watching the way the flowers seemed to glow in the wet, gray light. When I got home, I dried off, made a cup of tea, and settled down with the book again. The next entry caught my eye. Write a letter to someone who once made you smile. I hadn't written a letter in years. Who does that anymore? But the suggestion tugged at me, so I pulled out an old notepad and thought about who I might write to. After a while, I remembered a childhood friend, Daniel, who had moved away in the 5th grade. We'd been inseparable, the kind of friends who would spend entire summers building forts in backyards, riding bikes until sunset. I hadn't spoken to him since high school, but he had been one of the first people who made me feel like I truly belonged. I found an old address for his family online and wrote a short, awkward letter telling him about that memory. I didn't even expect it to reach him, but something about the act of writing felt good, like I was connecting with a part of myself I'd forgotten. The next morning, I flipped to a new page in the book. This entry read, "Go to a place you haven't visited since you were young. Look for something that feels the same." I decided to drive to a park where my dad used to take me when I was a kid. It was a small, quiet place with a pond and a few trails, nothing fancy, but it had been our little spot. When I got there, I realized that it had been overgrown and abandoned in the years since. I walked along the cracked paths, feeling the nostalgia settle in like a soft ache. Then, near the pond, I saw the old, crooked willow tree where we used to sit and talk, still standing there as if it had been waiting. With each page I turned, the book seemed to guide me to some memory, some part of myself that I'd put aside. There were no great revelations, no big answers, just gentle nudges to look around, reconnect, reflect. It felt like I was being slowly pulled out of the numbness of my daily routine, like a veil was lifting. A week passed, and then two, each entry leading me to small, meaningful moments. Watching the sunrise, calling an old friend, learning a recipe I'd always been too lazy to try. I found myself waking up with a different kind of anticipation, looking forward to what the book would tell me to do next. Then, about 3 weeks in, I came to an entry that stopped me in my tracks. It read, "Forgive yourself for the things you've left behind." The words hit me like a punch. I'd never really thought about it, but I'd been carrying around a lot of guilt. Guilt for relationships I'd let fade, dreams I hadn't pursued, risks I hadn't taken. I thought of all the versions of myself I'd abandoned along the way, all the times I'd chosen the safe path instead of the bold one. And suddenly, I found myself in tears, sitting on my bed with this old, strange book in my lap, realizing how much I'd been holding on to. That night, I wrote a letter to myself. I apologized to the version of me that used to dream big, the kid who once wanted to travel the world, the college student who thought he'd be a writer, not a project manager. And then, I forgave myself. Really, truly forgave myself for the life I'd built, even if it wasn't the one I'd once imagined. After that, the entries in the book changed. They became simpler, more direct. One day it said, "Smile at someone today." Another day it was just, "Take a deep breath." By the time I reached the last page, I felt like a different person. The book didn't transform my life overnight. I still went to the same job, had the same friends, but I felt lighter, like I'd found pieces of myself that I hadn't even known I'd lost. On the very last page, there was a single line, "Now go make your own instructions." I closed the book, realizing I'd probably never know who wrote it or why it found its way to that dusty little bookshop. But I was grateful. It had given me a way back to myself, a path through the ordinary, everyday moments that make up a life. Now, whenever I feel myself slipping back into the routine, I remember those entries. I write a new one whenever I feel the need. A reminder to look up at the sky, to send a message to an old friend, to forgive myself again and again. In a way, that book is still with me, not on my shelf, but in the way I've chosen to live. Small moments, quiet joys, and a sense of wonder that no longer feels so out of reach. It was just another Tuesday afternoon. I had ducked into a small bookstore in the city, a quiet place I sometimes visited to escape from the noise of life and thumb through old paperbacks. I didn't have anything particular in mind to buy, maybe a mystery novel or a classic I hadn't yet read. But as soon as I stepped inside, I noticed a small, dusty book tucked away on a bottom shelf. No title on the spine, no markings to say what it was. Just a plain leather cover, the edges worn smooth. Curiosity got the better of me. I knelt down and pulled it out. The cover felt strangely warm, almost alive, as if it had been sitting in sunlight, though I knew it hadn't. I opened it carefully, the pages fragile and yellowed. On the very first page, there was a handwritten note that read, "To be opened by those in need of a second chance." I chuckled a little, chalking it up to some author's artsy touch. But something about it tugged at me. Lately, my life had felt stuck. I was in a job I didn't love, in a relationship that felt comfortable but shallow. Every day felt like a replica of the last, and I'd been feeling this growing sense of something missing. A second chance, maybe it was exactly what I needed. Intrigued, I took the book to the counter. The cashier, an older man with reading glasses perched on the tip of his nose, looked surprised when he saw it. "Where'd you find this?" he asked, glancing at the book with a hint of recognition. "Just on one of the lower shelves," I replied. I thought it looked interesting. He hesitated, studying me with a look I couldn't quite place. Finally, he shrugged and rang it up, slipping the book into a paper bag. "Well, good luck with it," he said, and I could have sworn there was something cryptic in his tone. I took the book home, setting it on my nightstand and planning to start it that evening. I didn't get to it until after dinner, and when I finally opened it, I noticed something strange. The pages weren't filled with a story, at least not in any traditional sense. Instead, each page held only a few lines, a prompt, a question, or a phrase. They felt oddly personal, as though the book were speaking directly to me. The first line read, "What are you running from?" I stared at it, feeling a little uncomfortable. Was I running from something? I hadn't thought about it that way, but the question struck me. Maybe I was running from the idea of being trapped in a life I didn't choose, afraid of making decisions that could shatter my carefully constructed routines. The next few pages were filled with similar questions, each one unsettling, each one peeling back layers of myself I hadn't even realized were there. By the time I reached the middle of the book, I felt raw, exposed, as if the book were holding up a mirror to parts of myself I'd tried to ignore. Then, halfway through, the book took an unexpected turn. There was a page with a question that read, "If you could speak to your younger self, what would you say?" I sat with that question for a long time. I thought of my younger self, idealistic, brimming with dreams. I'd always wanted to write, to travel, to live a life full of meaning. Somewhere along the way, I'd buried those dreams, exchanged them for security and predictability. I realized I didn't even know who I was anymore. The next day, I went to work, but the questions from the book stayed with me, echoing in my mind. My boss called me in for a meeting to discuss a promotion, something I'd been aiming for years. But as he laid out the details of the role, I felt a strange sense of detachment, like I was listening to a plan for someone else's life. I thanked him and walked out of the office, feeling numb. I couldn't focus the rest of the day, and I kept thinking about that line. What would you say to your younger self? By the time I got home, I knew I had to read more. That night, I opened the book again, only to find another question waiting for me. What would you do if you weren't afraid? I was afraid. I realized afraid of change, of stepping away from everything I'd built. But what if I wasn't? The answer was almost painfully clear. I'd quit my job, pack up, and travel for a while. Maybe even try to write, just as I'd always wanted. It was such a simple answer, yet terrifying in its clarity. The next page had a list, almost like a set of instructions. 1. Do one thing you've been afraid to do. 2. Speak your truth to someone who needs to hear it. 3. Take a leap, even if you don't know where it will lead. I stared at those lines, feeling my heart beat faster. I thought of my relationship, my job, my entire life, and suddenly it felt like the book was daring me to do the impossible. To live in a way that was uncomfortably, even painfully honest. The next day, I sat down with my partner and had the conversation I'd been dreading for months. It was hard, messy, but also freeing. I told him the truth, that I wasn't happy, that I didn't know who I was anymore and needed to find out. He listened, and while it hurt both of us, he understood. The day after that, I handed in my resignation. My boss looked stunned, tried to talk me out of it, but I was resolute. For the first time in years, I felt something like lightness, as though I were finally shedding a skin I'd long outgrown. I kept reading the book, but by the time I reached the last page, it was blank. There were no final words of wisdom, no clear answers, just an empty page, as if it were waiting for me to fill it in. Over the next few months, I traveled. I saw places I'd only ever dreamed of, met people who lived with an openness I envied. I started writing again, filling notebook after notebook with thoughts, ideas, fragments of stories. I still didn't know where I was going, but I was finally moving, finally alive. One day, while sitting in a tiny cafe in a seaside town, I pulled the book from my bag. I hadn't looked at it in weeks, but something made me want to revisit it. When I opened it, I almost dropped it in surprise. The once empty last page was no longer blank. In faint, spidery handwriting, there were now 2 words, "Thank you." I blinked, feeling a chill run through me. Had I somehow missed those words before? But I knew, somehow, that I hadn't. I closed the book, realizing that I didn't need to understand it. I'd been given something precious, a reminder, a push, a second chance to live the life I'd always wanted. I returned home eventually, carrying that little book with me everywhere, though I no longer needed to read it. I knew that life was a question, one we answer every day, sometimes by stepping into the unknown, by being brave, and by trusting that whatever path we're on, it's the one we're meant to walk. And though I may never know who left that book in the bookstore, I like to think it found me at just the right time, when I was ready to finally live. The night had started as an escape. I'd spent the entire day in meetings, then a draining call with my mom about family drama I had no energy for. By 8 p.m., I was one text from my friend Ethan away from calling it a night. He'd insisted on dragging me out for just one drink at a bar down the street, and I'd agreed, figuring a change of scenery might help shake off the day's weight. When I got there, the bar was packed, buzzing with energy that was almost contagious. Ethan handed me a drink, his grin wide and mischievous, clearly proud of himself for getting me out of my post-work funk. We spent the next hour laughing, catching up, and people watching, just easing into the flow of the night. I started to relax, the stress melting away in the dim lights and loud music, until I found myself actually enjoying the buzz around me. That's when I saw him. He was sitting at the bar, leaning back with a quiet confidence, his eyes scanning the room in that casual way that people do when they're trying not to look bored. I couldn't help but notice the way he carried himself. Relaxed, detached, but with a kind of intensity that made him stand out from everyone else. As if he felt my gaze, he looked over, and our eyes met. He didn't smile right away, just held my gaze, and something about that brief moment felt like a spark. A few minutes later, he was standing next to me, introducing himself as Liam. He had one of those voices that was both calming and intriguing, and we fell into an easy conversation. It was the usual small talk at first, but there was an undertone of something else, an awareness that there was more to discover if we both decided to keep peeling back the layers. Time slipped by as we talked. We found ourselves gravitating toward a quieter corner of the bar, the noise around us fading into background music as he shared stories of his travels, his favorite books, and the weird coincidences that had shaped his life. He listened to me with a focus that felt rare, and before I knew it, I was sharing things I didn't normally reveal to people I just met. There was an honesty between us that felt refreshing, like we'd both decided to skip the usual guardedness and see what would happen. At some point, we moved outside, the crisp night air a welcome change from the warm, crowded bar. We strolled down the street, our shoulders brushing as we walked in companionable silence, both of us savoring the simplicity of it. The conversation picked up again, shifting to deeper topics. The things that scared us, the dreams we hadn't yet chased, the moments that had left marks we were still carrying. It felt surreal, how easy it was to open up to him, a stranger who somehow didn't feel like one. And then, as we stopped under a streetlight, he turned to me, his eyes soft but searching, and asked if he could kiss me. There was something tender in the way he asked, like he wanted me to be as sure about it as he was. I nodded, and the world seemed to quiet as he leaned in, his kiss soft, deliberate, and somehow both thrilling and comforting. We didn't even discuss what came next. It just felt natural when he took my hand, leading me back to his place a few blocks away. His apartment was small but cozy, filled with stacks of books and little pieces of art that looked like they'd each come with a story. We stayed up talking for hours, nestled on his couch, sharing secrets in hushed voices, like we were the only two people awake in the city. When we finally drifted off to sleep, it was with his arm around me, the quiet warmth of his presence, both grounding and electrifying. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace, like I'd stumbled into something I didn't even know I needed. The next morning, I woke up to the soft light filtering through his window. I turned to see him still asleep, his face relaxed and peaceful, and a pang of something unnameable struck me. I stayed there for a moment, watching him, feeling the weight of reality settle in around me. I knew that nights like these didn't often translate into anything more, that this connection, as real as it felt, might dissolve in the harshness of daylight. When he woke up, he gave me a sleepy smile, one that was both warm and a little sad, like he understood what I was feeling. We shared coffee, and the conversation was light, careful, both of us dancing around the unspoken acknowledgement that this might be the only morning we spent together. As I got ready to leave, he walked me to the door, his hand lingering on mine for just a moment longer than necessary. Last night was, he started, but trailed off like he couldn't quite find the words. I nodded, giving him a small smile, knowing that we both understood what he meant. There was no need to finish the sentence. The walk home was strange, the city buzzing around me as I tried to process everything. I felt grateful for the night, for the connection, for the chance to feel that spark again. But as I settled into the familiar quiet of my apartment, a bittersweet feeling crept in. I knew that while these moments are beautiful, they're also fragile, rarely built to last. Over the next few days, I kept thinking about him, about the way he'd listened, the way he'd looked at me like he was seeing something beyond the surface. I realized that as thrilling as the night had been, it had also left me wanting something more. It wasn't just the connection or the chemistry. It was the feeling of being understood, of sharing a moment with someone who felt just as invested as I was. That night with Liam taught me that while fleeting connections are exciting, they aren't always enough. I wanted something that could carry through the daylight, something that didn't fade with the morning sun. And though I was still grateful for the memory, it also left me with a clearer sense of what I was truly looking for, a connection that wasn't just about a moment, but about the moments that would follow. So now, when I go out, I carry that knowledge with me. I still believe in the magic of unexpected nights, but I also know that I'm looking for something deeper, something that doesn't end with a goodbye at dawn. Until then, I'll keep the memory of that perfect night, a reminder of the kind of connection I know is possible, waiting for the day I find it again in a way that lasts. The night had started as an escape. I'd spent the entire day in meetings, then a draining call with my mom about family drama I had no energy for. By 8 p.m., I was one text from my friend Ethan away from calling it a night. He'd insisted on dragging me out for just one drink at a bar down the street, and I'd agreed, figuring a change of scenery might help shake off the day's weight. When I got there, the bar was packed, buzzing with energy that was almost contagious. Ethan handed me a drink, his grin wide and mischievous, clearly proud of himself for getting me out of my post-work funk. We spent the next hour laughing, catching up, and people watching, just easing into the flow of the night. I started to relax, the stress melting away in the dim lights and loud music, until I found myself actually enjoying the buzz around me. That's when I saw him. He was sitting at the bar, leaning back with a quiet confidence, his eyes scanning the room in that casual way that people do when they're trying not to look bored. I couldn't help but notice the way he carried himself. Relaxed, detached, but with a kind of intensity that made him stand out from everyone else. As if he felt my gaze, he looked over, and our eyes met. He didn't smile right away, just held my gaze, and something about that brief moment felt like a spark. A few minutes later, he was standing next to me, introducing himself as Liam. He had one of those voices that was both calming and intriguing, and we fell into an easy conversation. It was the usual small talk at first, but there was an undertone of something else, an awareness that there was more to discover if we both decided to keep peeling back the layers. Time slipped by as we talked. We found ourselves gravitating toward a quieter corner of the bar, the noise around us fading into background music as he shared stories of his travels, his favorite books, and the weird coincidences that had shaped his life. He listened to me with a focus that felt rare, and before I knew it, I was sharing things I didn't normally reveal to people I just met. There was an honesty between us that felt refreshing, like we'd both decided to skip the usual guardedness and see what would happen. At some point, we moved outside. The crisp night air a welcome change from the warm, crowded bar. We strolled down the street, our shoulders brushing as we walked in companionable silence, both of us savoring the simplicity of it. The conversation picked up again, shifting to deeper topics. The things that scared us, the dreams we hadn't yet chased, the moments that had left marks we were still carrying. It felt surreal, how easy it was to open up to him, a stranger who somehow didn't feel like one. And then, as we stopped under a streetlight, he turned to me, his eyes soft but searching, and asked if he could kiss me. There was something tender in the way he asked, like he wanted me to be as sure about it as he was. I nodded, and the world seemed to quiet as he leaned in, his kiss soft, deliberate, and somehow both thrilling and comforting. We didn't even discuss what came next. It just felt natural when he took my hand, leading me back to his place a few blocks away. His apartment was small but cozy, filled with stacks of books and little pieces of art that looked like they'd each come with a story. We stayed up talking for hours, nestled on his couch, sharing secrets in hushed voices, like we were the only two people awake in the city. When we finally drifted off to sleep, it was with his arm around me, the quiet warmth of his presence both grounding and electrifying. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace, like I'd stumbled into something I didn't even know I needed. The next morning, I woke up to the soft light filtering through his window. I turned to see him still asleep, his face relaxed and peaceful, and a pang of something unnameable struck me. I stayed there for a moment, watching him, feeling the weight of reality settle in around me. I knew that nights like these didn't often translate into anything more, that this connection, as real as it felt, might dissolve in the harshness of daylight. When he woke up, he gave me a sleepy smile, one that was both warm and a little sad, like he understood what I was feeling. We shared coffee, and the conversation was light, careful, both of us dancing around the unspoken acknowledgement that this might be the only morning we spent together. As I got ready to leave, he walked me to the door, his hand lingering on mine for just a moment longer than necessary. Last night was, he started, but trailed off, like he couldn't quite find the words. I nodded, giving him a small smile, knowing that we both understood what he meant. There was no need to finish the sentence. The walk home was strange, the city buzzing around me as I tried to process everything. I felt grateful for the night, for the connection, for the chance to feel that spark again. But as I settled into the familiar quiet of my apartment, a bittersweet feeling crept in. I knew that while these moments are beautiful, they're also fragile, rarely built to last. Over the next few days, I kept thinking about him, about the way he'd listened, the way he looked at me like he was seeing something beyond the surface. I realized that as thrilling as the night had been, it had also left me wanting something more. It wasn't just the connection or the chemistry. It was the feeling of being understood, of sharing a moment with someone who felt just as invested as I was. That night with Liam taught me that while fleeting connections are exciting, they aren't always enough. I wanted something that could carry through the daylight, something that didn't fade with the morning sun. And though I was still grateful for the memory, it also left me with a clearer sense of what I was truly looking for, a connection that wasn't just about a moment, but about the moments that would follow. So now, when I go out, I carry that knowledge with me. I still believe in the magic of unexpected nights, but I also know that I'm looking for something deeper, something that doesn't end with a goodbye at dawn. Until then, I'll keep the memory of that perfect night, a reminder of the kind of connection I know is possible, waiting for the day I find it again in a way that lasts. I met Ryan at a local trivia night, where we'd been on rival teams. He was witty, knew way too much about obscure 80s pop culture, and had a smile that lit up the whole bar. By the end of the night, he'd struck up a friendly rivalry with me, bantering back and forth in a way that was fun and flirtatious. When he asked if he could take me out sometime, I agreed, thinking why not? A guy who could make me laugh and actually knew how to spell Dostoevsky on the first try? He seemed like a rare find. Our first date was at this trendy sushi place downtown. I arrived to see him waiting outside, looking genuinely excited, and he greeted me with a big hug. We sat down, ordered drinks, and picked out a few rolls to share. Conversation flowed effortlessly. He had stories for days, growing up in a small town, traveling solo through Southeast Asia, his weird collection of vintage concert t-shirts. It was refreshing. For the first time in ages, I felt like I was actually connecting with someone. Then, about halfway through the date, he gave me a playful nudge and said, "All right, I've got a surprise for you." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued but slightly cautious. He reached down into his bag and pulled out a small velvet pouch. Inside was a polished amethyst stone, which he presented to me with great ceremony. "This," he announced, "is a crystal for positive energy. I thought you might like it." I chuckled, thinking he was joking, but his face was completely serious. "Thanks, I think," I said, turning the stone over in my hand. He nodded, thrilled. "It's really special. I take mine everywhere." He then proceeded to pull out his own crystal, a larger, rough-edged rose quartz. "This one's for love and compassion," he explained, holding it up proudly like it was a rare gem. I forced a polite smile, not quite sure what to make of it. But before I could even say anything, he launched into a full-blown explanation of the healing power of crystals. For the next 10 minutes, he passionately explained his spiritual journey and how he was working to align his chakras. I'd barely nodded when he suddenly grabbed my hand and closed his eyes. "I can feel your energy," he whispered, squeezing my hand as he breathed deeply. I sat there, frozen, wondering if I'd accidentally walked into some sort of spiritual intervention. I managed a shaky laugh and gently pulled my hand away, but he didn't seem to notice. He was completely absorbed in what I could only describe as a one-sided seance. When the food arrived, I thought we'd be back to normal. but he barely touched his sushi, saying he was cleansing and had recently adopted an energy-only diet. I tried to ask him what that meant, hoping for a simple answer, but he went on to explain that he believed consuming food interfered with the flow of life force, and that he only ate organic light-energy foods, whatever that meant. I sat there, trying to keep a straight face, as he detailed his diet of raw almonds, kale juice, and something he called sun-charged water. And just when I thought the night couldn't get any stranger, he pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. "I feel like we're meant to be in each other's lives," he said, looking deeply into my eyes. "Would it be okay if I wrote a poem about your energy?" I wasn't sure if I should laugh, cry, or make a run for it, but I felt too awkward to say no. So I just nodded, figuring this was harmless enough. He closed his eyes, took a deep, meditative breath, and began muttering under his breath as he scribbled in his notebook, occasionally glancing up at me, as if to capture some essence only he could see. After about 5 minutes of intense scribbling, he looked up, beaming. "Done," he announced proudly, and began reading aloud. It was a strange, flowery verse about auras merging and souls colliding like galaxies. His voice was earnest, almost reverent, and I found myself caught between secondhand embarrassment and pure fascination. When he finished, he looked up at me expectantly, as if waiting for some deep response. "It's beautiful," I managed, trying not to burst out laughing. He looked genuinely touched, nodding as if he'd just shared a profound revelation. "Thank you," he whispered, reaching for my hand again. "I just felt such a strong connection with you." I nodded, forcing a smile, and muttered something about needing to use the restroom. I practically sprinted to the bathroom, where I stared at myself in the mirror, trying to process what was happening. I'd come out for sushi and a good time, and somehow ended up in a bizarre pseudo-spiritual ritual with a man who thought eating kale juice and sun water was a lifestyle. When I got back to the table, he was sitting cross-legged in the booth, eyes closed, meditating with his hands on his crystals. I sat down, and he slowly opened his eyes, looking at me with a dreamy smile. "I'm really glad we're doing this," he said softly. "You have no idea how rare it is to meet someone with such pure energy." At that moment, the server brought the check, and I jumped at the chance to end the date. "Oh, I'll get this," I offered, hoping to wrap things up. But he stopped me, pulling out a folded piece of paper. "Actually, I prefer to pay in cash," he explained, handing the server a few dollar bills with great ceremony. I glanced over and noticed he'd left a tip in the form of, no joke, a small crystal. The poor server looked bewildered, holding the crystal between 2 fingers as if it might burn her. We stepped outside, and as I made a polite excuse about needing to get home, he took my hand one last time, looking deeply into my eyes. "Thank you for tonight. I feel like we shared something cosmic." I managed a weak smile and quickly pulled my hand away, muttering a quick goodbye. As I walked to my car, I could feel him watching me, probably blessing me with light energy or something equally surreal. The next morning, he texted me a picture of a crystal on his windowsill with the caption, "Charging this in the sun and thinking of you." I never responded. For days afterward, I couldn't shake the memory of that date. The crystals, the poem, the earnest meditative session in the sushi booth. It became my go-to story with friends, a cautionary tale of how seemingly normal people can have truly unexpected layers. And while I can respect anyone's spiritual beliefs, I decided then and there that next time I'd stick with someone who was a little more grounded. Maybe even someone who just eats sushi like a regular person. I met Ben at a coffee shop after bumping into him. Literally, I spilled half my latte on him, and instead of looking annoyed, he grinned and said something cheesy about how he'd take a coffee shower any day if it meant meeting me. I laughed, more out of surprise than anything, but there was something kind of magnetic about his confidence. We chatted for a bit, and by the time we both finished our drinks, he'd asked me out to dinner the following Friday. I couldn't help but feel like maybe this was one of those serendipitous moments you read about. The night of the date, he picked a small tapas restaurant. I got there first, and as soon as he walked in, I knew he'd put effort into his outfit. He looked great. We started off with wine and a few dishes to share, and everything was flowing nicely. He had this funny, slightly sarcastic sense of humor that kept me laughing. It felt like one of those rare dates where everything just clicks. But somewhere around the second glass of wine, he leaned forward and gave me this intense look. "All right," he said, dead serious. "I think we should just get it all out on the table." I blinked, confused. "Get what out on the table?" I asked, half laughing, assuming he was joking. But he wasn't. He took a deep breath and said, "Let's lay out all our red flags right now. Like, just be completely honest so there's no surprises later." I laughed, thinking he was kidding, but he just looked at me, waiting. "Come on, everybody is red flags," he continued, gesturing with his fork for emphasis. "I think it's better if we just get them all out there now. Like, for example," he paused, then leaned in conspiratorially. "I have a little issue with commitment." He said it so nonchalantly, as if it were just a fun fact about himself. And by little issue, I mean, I've never really had a long-term relationship. Like ever. I nodded slowly, trying to keep my face neutral, though my mind was screaming red flag. Red flag? But he didn't stop there. He then proceeded to list every reason he thought he was a bad bet for a relationship. "I'm kind of a workaholic," he admitted, swirling his wine. "I mean, I work nights, weekends, it's my passion. I might cancel plans last minute if something important comes up." He paused, studying my reaction. "Oh, and I'm terrible at texting back," he added almost as an afterthought. "Like, if you text me, there's a good chance I might just forget for a day or two." I took a sip of my wine, thinking he had to be finished, but he just kept going. "Also, I have a huge family. They're loud, they're nosy, and they think every girl I date is the one. So, if we keep seeing each other, you'll probably meet them way sooner than you wanna." He laughed, seemingly unfazed by the stunned expression that had now taken over my face. "Anything else?" I asked, half joking, though at this point, I was bracing myself. He grinned. "Actually, yeah, I hate pets." I almost choked on my wine. "You hate pets?" He nodded, completely serious. "Dogs, cats, all of it. Not for me. I had a dog once, and it was a nightmare. I'm just not an animal person, you know?" By now, I was looking around the restaurant, almost hoping someone would pull a fire alarm so I could make a quick exit. But he wasn't done. "Oh, and one last thing, I'm not great with money." He shrugged, like this was just a normal thing to drop on someone over tapas. "I mean, I have a good job, but I like to spend. Budgeting's not really my thing. So if you're into saving or like planning for the future, yeah, that's not me." I sat there, wondering if this was some elaborate prank. He looked at me expectantly, like he'd just shared a totally normal list of quirks, and then said, "So, now that you know all that, what about you? What are your red flags?" I laughed a little too loudly and said, "Wow, I feel like mine are pretty tame compared to yours." But he was staring at me with genuine curiosity, like he really wanted to know. So I started slow, trying to think of something that would keep up with his level of honesty. "Oh well, I guess I could be a little bit of a neat freak," I said, trying to sound serious. He nodded, like that was a major flaw. "Oh, and I like dogs," I added almost defiantly. He frowned, looking genuinely disappointed. "But we can work around that, right?" I added, half jokingly, but he just shrugged, not looking convinced. We sat there for a moment, staring at each other over half-eaten plates of tapas. I knew I wasn't going to see him again, but there was something almost morbidly fascinating about him that kept me from making an excuse to leave. I think he sensed that too, because he suddenly leaned back, laughing. "Well, at least we were honest," he said, raising his glass for a toast. "Here's to all our terrible traits." I clinked my glass with his, trying not to laugh at the absurdity of it all. The rest of the night was a weird mix of him detailing more of his flaws, and me trying not to react too obviously. By the time the check came, I was already mentally drafting the text I'd send to my friends about Mr. Red Flag. He walked me to my car, gave me a friendly hug, and said, "You're cool. Let's do this again sometime." I nodded, smiling politely, but as soon as I was in my car, I laughed so hard I nearly cried. It was like he decided to hand me a personalized warning label on our first date. I never texted him back, but a week later, he sent me a message. "Hey, haven't heard from you." Was it something I said? I could have listed his entire evening's monologue back to him, but instead, I just replied with a simple, "Not a match." It was the first time I'd ever felt like I was ghosting someone as a public service. Looking back, I I realized he probably saved me a lot of trouble by unloading his entire personality in one go. I still laugh every time I think of him, like a walking cautionary tale, a reminder that sometimes the best first date is the last one. There's something strange about realizing you don't recognize your own life anymore. For me, that moment happened on an ordinary Wednesday morning. I was in line at the cafe I'd stopped at every day for the past 5 years, waiting for my usual latte. But when the barista handed me my cup, he gave me a puzzled look and said, "You okay?" It caught me off guard. "Yeah, why?" He hesitated, glancing at me like he was looking for the right words. "You just look different. Like, not your usual self." I forced a smile and laughed it off, but the comment lingered in my mind all day. Different? What did that even mean? I spent the afternoon trying to shake it off, but I kept catching my reflection in the office windows, wondering if I looked different. Same gray suit, same stiff smile. What had he seen that I couldn't? That night, I went home to my apartment, my routine clicking into autopilot. I dropped my bag, tossed my keys on the counter, and opened the fridge to stare at the same sad leftovers I'd been meaning to toss. It was as if I was watching someone else's life play out in front of me, like I'd stepped into a role I didn't remember auditioning for. Without thinking too much about it, I threw on my shoes and grabbed my jacket. I didn't know where I was going, just somewhere not here. I ended the first time I walked into the club. I thought I was prepared. I'd seen a dozen movies, talked to a few friends who had been dancers, and even practiced in front of the mirror with my heels. But nothing really gets you ready for the first night. The club was loud, neon lights flashing everywhere, the smell of perfume and cigarettes hanging in the air, and laughter and cheers echoing from every corner. I'd spent hours that day convincing myself I could do this, that I could step into this new world and play the part, even if it felt like a costume. The manager introduced me to a couple of the other dancers, who were all lounging in the back, checking their makeup and chatting like they were just at any other job. They didn't look at me like I was competition or even like I was new. They looked at me like they'd seen 100 girls just like me before. A couple of them gave me tips. Make eye contact, it's all in the eyes, and don't let anyone make you do what you don't feel right about. I nodded, storing every bit of advice I could get, but I was still on edge, my heart pounding every time I thought about going out there. When they called my name for the first time, my stomach did a flip. The announcer's voice was booming, introducing me like I was some kind of celebrity, which honestly made me laugh a little. That laugh was the only thing that kept me moving, kept me from turning around and running right back to the dressing room. I took a deep breath, forced a smile, and walked out onto the stage. The lights hit me instantly, brighter than I expected, blinding me to everything except the outlines of faces and the faint shadows of people moving. I grabbed onto the pole like it was my lifeline, realizing then just how different this was from practicing in front of a mirror. The music was pounding, the bass vibrating through my chest, and I felt like I was on autopilot. I didn't have any fancy moves, nothing choreographed, just a few slow spins I'd learned from a YouTube video and a walk that I hoped looked more confident than I felt. I focused on breathing, on keeping my movements smooth, pretending like I was in control. The crowd started cheering, and I could feel their energy building, giving me a strange sense of power. Just when I thought I was finally getting into the swing of things, I spotted a group of college guys near the edge of the stage, shouting my name, waving dollar bills. One of them leaned forward, yelling something ridiculous like, "Marry me." I couldn't help it. I started laughing. I tossed my hair, gave him a little wink, and the crowd went wild. That was the moment something clicked, like I suddenly got it. I wasn't just on display. I was the one calling the shots, deciding what they got to see, what they didn't. That laugh was real, and it made everything else feel a little less scary. After the set, I wobbled back to the dressing room, my legs feeling like jelly. The other dancers were there, giving me nods of approval, one even handing me a bottle of water. "Not bad for your first time," she said with a grin. I sat down, chugging the water, feeling this mix of pride and disbelief. I'd actually done it. Later that night, I got my first VIP room request. I'd heard about these private rooms from the other girls, and while some were fine with them, others warned me to be careful. I was nervous, but I told myself I could handle it. The guy was older, dressed in a suit that looked more expensive than my rent. He smiled, polite and friendly, and I started to relax a bit. He didn't make any moves, didn't touch. Just sat there, watching me dance, nodding along to the music, and occasionally making small talk. I think he could tell I was new, nervous, and trying to find my footing. At one point, he just said, "You're doing great. Relax. You don't have to do anything you don't want to." That small kindness meant everything. When the session ended, he tipped me more than I made all night on stage. By the time I left the club, the sun was starting to rise. I walked out feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration, a surreal kind of pride. That night was a test, one I didn't think I'd be able to pass, but somehow I had. I'd been in control, decided what parts of myself I wanted to show, and discovered something powerful within me that I hadn't known was there. That first night was the beginning of something I could never have predicted, a chapter of independence, resilience, and confidence I'd carry with me long after I left that life behind. A few months ago, I went to a small, local art gallery with my best friend, Nora. It was her idea, one of those spontaneous plans we make to pull each other out of our routines. She's the kind of friend who's always finding something new for us to try, whether it's pottery classes or cooking lessons. That day, it was an art show, an exhibit dedicated to forgotten moments, which sounded interesting enough, even if I didn't fully understand what that meant. The gallery was quiet, with soft jazz playing faintly in the background. It was one of those places that feels timeless, with white walls and warm lighting casting everything in a kind of gentle glow. I walked slowly through the rooms, studying paintings and sketches of ordinary scenes. A coffee cup on a windowsill, a child's lost shoe lying in the middle of a path, a letter folded on a nightstand. Each piece seemed unremarkable at first, until you looked closer and felt this strange sense of intimacy, like you were seeing fragments of other people's lives, moments they'd never intended to share. I was absorbed in a piece of an elderly man feeding pigeons when I noticed a small, unframed photograph on the wall. It was an odd, almost candid snapshot of a woman standing alone on a street corner at dusk. The image was grainy, but there was something so achingly familiar about it, like I'd seen it before. The woman was facing away from the camera, her head tilted slightly, as if she'd just heard her name called. Her hair was tied up in a scarf, her coat buttoned all the way to her chin, like she was bracing against the cold. I felt this unsettling pull in my chest as I stared at it. It was irrational, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I knew this woman, that I was supposed to know her, though I had no idea how. The gallery had little cards with details about each piece, so I leaned in to check. The description read, "Untitled. Artist unknown. Found in a flea market. Date unknown." Creepy, right? Nora had come up beside me, and her eyes were fixed on the photo. "She looks like she's waiting for something." "Yeah," I murmured, unable to look away. "Or someone." We spent the rest of the afternoon in the gallery, but that photo stayed with me. I couldn't get the image of that woman out of my head. Her face turned slightly towards something I couldn't see, her expression unreadable. That night, lying in bed, I found myself thinking about her, wondering who she was, what she was waiting for. Days passed, but she wouldn't leave my mind. Then, about a week after seeing the exhibit, I started noticing strange little details in my own life. It was subtle at first, glancing at my phone to see the time and finding it frozen on 6:37, the exact time listed under the photograph in the gallery. A song I'd never heard before played on the radio during my drive home, one that repeated the same refrain over and over. "Don't look back." I shrugged it off, figuring it was my mind playing tricks, a weird leftover feeling from the gallery. But that didn't explain the dreams. They started out faint, fragments I couldn't remember in the morning, just the feeling of something half-forgotten. Then one night I dreamed of her. In the dream, I was walking down a dark, quiet street, the world around me washed in shades of blue and gray. Ahead of me was the woman from the photograph, standing exactly as she had in the image, her head tilted toward me. She was holding something, a small, worn book with a leather cover. She reached out, her eyes locking onto mine, and I felt this deep, inexplicable urgency to go to her. But before I could, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. I woke up with my heart pounding, an unfamiliar weight in my chest. I spent the next day feeling off-kilter, like I'd brushed up against something I wasn't supposed to understand. I tried to tell myself it was just a strange dream, but that night, I dreamed of her again, and this time she spoke. "I'm waiting," she whispered, her voice distant, like an echo. "Don't let me be forgotten." When I woke up, I was shaking. I couldn't pretend it was just a dream anymore. It felt like something more, like a message from someone or something that had slipped through the cracks of my life. I sat there in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was going crazy. But the strangest part was, I felt this overwhelming need to find her. Over the next few days, I tried everything I could think of. I researched the photograph online, scoured forums for clues, even went back to the gallery. But no one knew where it had come from. The curator told me it had been part of a collection donated anonymously, with no information on its origin. I left the gallery that day feeling strangely empty, like I'd lost something I hadn't even known I needed. The dreams continued. Every night, the woman would appear, a little closer, her eyes sadder, her voice fainter. It was as if she were slipping away, fading into the background of my mind, and I felt this unbearable guilt, though I didn't know why. Each time, she whispered the same words. "Don't let me be forgotten." Finally, one night, I decided to do something I hadn't done in years. I sat down at my desk, opened an empty notebook, and started writing. I wrote about the gallery, the photograph, the dreams, every detail I could remember. I wrote about the way her presence felt, the way her eyes seemed to reach into a part of myself I'd been avoiding for years. I didn't know what I was doing or why, but as I wrote, something inside me eased, a knot I hadn't realized I'd been carrying loosened. By dawn, I had filled pages and pages. When I finished, I felt empty but lighter, as though I'd finally honored her in some way. I closed the notebook, feeling strangely at peace. That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept without dreaming. I woke up the next morning feeling like myself again, as if something that had been haunting me had finally let go. I hadn't solved any mysteries, hadn't uncovered any grand truths, but I felt like I'd done something important. I'd remembered her, whoever she was, and that felt like enough. A few days later, I returned to the gallery one last time, hoping to find the photograph still hanging there. But when I reached the spot where it had been, the wall was empty. I asked the curator about it, and she looked confused. "We never had a photo like that in the collection," she said, glancing at me curiously. "Are you sure you saw it here?" I wanted to argue, to insist that I'd seen it, held it in my hands. But something stopped me. I simply nodded, feeling a strange sense of closure settle over me. As I walked out of the gallery, I felt that familiar, ghostly presence beside me one last time, warm and gentle, like a hand on my shoulder. And then, she was gone. Since then, I haven't dreamed of her. I still have the notebook, filled with everything I could remember, and sometimes I flip through it, wondering if I'll ever understand what it all meant. I never found answers, but I've come to realize that some mysteries don't need to be solved. Some memories, some people, only need to be remembered, and maybe, in some way, that's all she ever wanted. There's something strange about realizing you don't recognize your own life anymore. For me, that moment happened on an ordinary Wednesday morning. I was in line at the cafe I'd stopped at every day for the past 5 years, waiting for my usual latte. But when the barista handed me my cup, he gave me a puzzled look and said, "You okay?" It caught me off guard. "Yeah, why?" He hesitated, glancing at me like he was looking for the right words. "You just look different. Like, not your usual self." I forced a smile and laughed it off, but the comment lingered in my mind all day. Different? What did that even mean? I spent the afternoon trying to shake it off, but I kept catching my reflection in the office windows, wondering if I looked different. Same gray suit, same stiff smile. What had he seen that I couldn't? That night, I went home to my apartment, my routine clicking into autopilot. I dropped my bag, tossed my keys on the counter, and opened the fridge to stare at the same sad leftovers I'd been meaning to toss. It was as if I was watching someone else's life play out in front of me, like I'd stepped into a role I didn't remember auditioning for. Without thinking too much about it, I threw on my shoes and grabbed my jacket. I didn't know where I was going, to somewhere not here. I ended up walking aimlessly, letting the cool evening air clear my head. It felt good to walk without a destination for once, without the pressure to be somewhere. About 15 minutes in, I spotted a little shop on a side street that I'd never noticed before. It had no sign, no clear indication of what it was, just a single, dim light in the window and rows of antique-looking trinkets and oddities displayed inside. Curiosity tugged at me, and I decided to go in. The bell jingled as I opened the door, and the smell of old paper and polished would hit me. The place was packed floor to ceiling with all sorts of strange things: vintage clocks, brass compasses, dusty novels, and, oddly enough, a whole wall of old Polaroid cameras. An elderly man behind the counter looked up from his book, giving me a warm, almost knowing smile. "Evening," he said, his voice as creaky as the old floorboards. "Looking for something specific?" I shrugged. "Not really. Just looking." He nodded as if he understood, which was surprising. How could he know what I was looking for when I didn't even know myself? I wandered around, running my fingers over the shelves, my eyes drifting from one odd item to the next. And then I noticed a small, hand-painted sign on the wall that read, "Find what you've lost." I stared at it, feeling a strange pull in my chest. What had I lost? It was an uncomfortable question, one I hadn't really let myself consider. Somehow, standing there, I felt like there was an answer nearby. My eyes landed on a small box on the shelf beneath the sign. It was a worn, wooden box with a brass latch. Nothing flashy, but something about it drew me in. I reached out, opened it, and found a single item inside: an old key. It was heavy, with an intricate design on the handle that looked like it belonged to an ancient door or a forgotten chest. Without thinking, I picked it up and took it to the counter. The man behind the counter raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Ah," he said, leaning closer to inspect the key. "Interesting choice." I laughed, a bit embarrassed. "Does it open anything?" "Oh, it might," he replied, that knowing smile creeping onto his face again. "But not always in the way you'd expect." He wrapped the key carefully and handed it to me, saying, "Sometimes a key is just a reminder to unlock something within, rather than a door." It sounded like a line from a movie, but I took it. I tucked the key into my pocket, paid, and walked out with a strange sense of anticipation, like something was going to happen. That night, I found myself lying in bed, the key resting on my nightstand, catching the light from my lamp. I didn't know why I'd bought it. I had no use for an old key, and yet there was something oddly comforting about having it. A reminder, the man had said, but of what? The next morning, I woke up early and decided to walk to work, taking a detour through the park. I stopped by a bench near the lake, watching as the early morning sun cast a soft glow over the water. The world felt quiet, different, like it had slowed down just for a moment. And then, out of nowhere, I remembered something, a memory from years ago when I was just starting out. I'd been sitting on this very bench, sketchbook in hand, doodling designs for some imaginary business I dreamed of starting. Back then, I'd wanted to create things, to build something meaningful. But somehow, over the years, that part of me had faded, drowned out by meetings, deadlines, and a job that was stable but soul-sucking. I dug the key out of my pocket and held it, feeling the weight of it in my hand. I couldn't shake the feeling that it had brought me back to this bench, to that forgotten version of myself who had once been filled with so much excitement and possibility. For the next few days, I kept the key with me, carrying it like a talisman. I started noticing things I hadn't before, like how tired my coworkers looked, or how the same elevator music played on a loop every day, as if we were all sleepwalking through our lives. I saw pieces of myself reflected in everyone else, and it only made me more determined to break out of the cycle. The key reminded me of a promise I'd made to myself, one that I hadn't even realized I'd forgotten. A promise to follow my passions, to create, to live a life that felt like my own. I hadn't held myself to it in years, and now it was like the key was silently urging me to keep it. One evening, fueled by some strange mix of courage and nostalgia, I sat down and started sketching again. Just simple designs, ideas for a business that didn't even exist yet. The act of drawing felt freeing, like I was peeling back layers of doubt and fear, rediscovering parts of myself I'd buried under practicality and convenience. After weeks of sketching, planning, and if I'm being honest, agonizing over the what-ifs, I finally made a decision. I gave my notice at work. I didn't have everything figured out yet, but I knew I needed to try something different to see if I could build something that was genuinely mine. With the help of a small savings cushion and a few encouraging friends, I took the plunge and started a small online business, designing custom pieces for clients. It wasn't glamorous, and it definitely wasn't easy, but it was real. It was mine. Now, months later, the key still sits on my desk as a reminder of that strange, pivotal night in the shop. Whenever I start to doubt myself, to wonder if I made the right choice, I hold it and remember the man's words. Sometimes a key is just a reminder to unlock something within. I still don't know if the shop was real, or if the man was some kind of mysterious guide, but I know one thing. The key unlocked a door I didn't even know I'd closed. And in stepping through it, I found myself again. I was just finishing a late shift at the restaurant, the kind that left me smelling like onions and grease when I felt my phone buzz in my pocket. It was an unknown number, one of those calls you almost don't answer because you know it's probably spam. But something made me swipe to pick up. Hello. There was a pause, and then a familiar voice filled my ear. Is this Mia? Mia? I froze, the restaurant noise fading around me. Yes, who is this? It's Danny. Danny Lewis. Danny Lewis. I hadn't heard that name in 15 years. He was the kid I'd sat next to in biology class, the guy who used to lend me his notes when I missed school, the friend who had been like a brother to me until he disappeared. One day he was there, with his scruffy backpack and shy smile, and the next he was gone. He'd moved away so suddenly that I hadn't even had a chance to say goodbye. We tried to stay in touch at first, exchanging a few letters, maybe 1 or 2 calls. But over time, the letters grew less frequent, the calls dwindling into nothing. Eventually, he became a memory, tucked away into that dusty corner of the past where you store people you think you'll never see again. Mia, you still there? I shook myself out of my daze, trying to keep my voice steady. Yeah, sorry. Wow, Danny, it's been a long time. Too long, he said, a nervous laugh escaping him. I know this is out of the blue, but I'm back in town, and I thought, maybe we could catch up? There was something in his voice, a hesitation that made me pause. But before I could think twice, I heard myself say, yeah, of course. When? Tonight? I could come by wherever you are. A part of me wanted to make up an excuse, to stall, to give myself more time to process. But there was something compelling about the idea of seeing him again. Sure, I said, glancing around. I'm at the Silver Spoon on 5th. I'll be out front in a few. Great. I'll be there soon. When the call ended, I slipped my phone back into my pocket, feeling the weight of memories pressing down on me. I made my way outside, the chill of the night air hitting my skin, and waited. A few minutes later, I saw him walking up the street, hands in his pockets, looking just like the Danny I remembered, only older. His hair was shorter, his frame broader, but the way he moved, that familiar loping stride, was still the same. Mia. He smiled, and just like that, it was as if no time had passed at all. Danny. I grinned back, feeling the years melt away. We hugged, a little awkwardly, like we were both testing the waters, and then pulled back, laughing at how strange it all felt. He nodded down the street. There's a coffee shop still open around the corner. Want to grab a cup? We walked in comfortable silence, just like we used to when we'd wander around town after school, talking about everything and nothing. The coffee shop was nearly empty, its warm lights casting a cozy glow over the tables. We sat by the window, 2 cups of coffee steaming between us, and for a moment, we just looked at each other, both of us a little lost in the past. So, I said, breaking the silence, where did you go? He looked down at his coffee, his fingers tracing the rim of the mug. We moved to California. My mom, well, she got remarried. Things changed fast. One day we were here, and the next we were gone. You didn't tell me. I hadn't meant for the words to sound so sharp, but they came out that way, edged with the hurt I'd carried all these years. He nodded, looking up with a guilty expression. I know. I'm sorry. I don't know. Scared? I guess I thought leaving without a word would make it easier. Easier for who? I asked, half laughing, half hurt. I looked for you, Danny. I called, I wrote, I didn't understand. I know, he said softly, his voice thick. I messed up, Mia. I've thought about it so many times, all the things I should have done differently. But I thought maybe you'd forgotten about me. Forgotten you? I shook my head. The idea is so absurd it almost made me laugh. Danny, you were my best friend. You don't just forget people like that. A silence fell over us, heavy and sad, like we were both carrying the weight of all those years. But then he looked at me, and I saw that same spark in his eyes, that same warmth that had always made him feel like home. So, what have you been up to? He asked, his voice lighter, as if trying to shift the mood. I shrugged, smiling wryly. Nothing much. Working here and there still in this town. I kept it low-key. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. I get that. After a while, I just drifted from place to place. Try to find something. I don't even know what. I didn't ask what he was looking for, but I could tell from the look in his eyes that he hadn't found it. We talked for hours, each story another stitch, weaving together the years we'd missed. He told me about his life in California, the odd jobs, the brief stints in different cities, the nights he'd spent alone, wondering if he'd made a mistake by leaving. I told him about the life I'd built here, the small joys, the little struggles, the things that kept me anchored. At some point, the conversation slowed, and we fell into a comfortable silence, just like the old days. It was strange being with him again, like slipping on a worn sweater that still fit, even after all this time. Finally, he looked at me, his eyes serious. Mia, I came back because I realized something. I don't know what I'm doing with my life, but I know that the last time I felt sure of anything was when I was here, with you. His words hung in the air, soft but powerful, echoing the unspoken feelings I'd kept buried for so long. Danny, I started, unsure of what to say. He reached across the table, his hand covering mine. I'm not asking for anything, he said quietly. I just needed to tell you. That's all. We sat there, our hands clasped, the silence filled with a sense of peace, of something coming full circle. Maybe we couldn't go back, couldn't change what had happened. But in that moment, it felt like enough to simply be here, together, letting the past settle into place. When we finally left the coffee shop, the sky was starting to lighten, the first faint hints of dawn breaking over the horizon. We walked slowly back to where we'd parked, the cool morning air crisp against our faces. As we reached my car, he turned to me, a hopeful smile tugging at his lips. Think we could do this again sometime? He asked, his voice soft, tentative. I smiled back, feeling the warmth of his hand still lingering on mine. Yeah, I said, my voice steady. I'd like that. And as I drove away, watching him in the rearview mirror until he faded into the distance, I felt something lift, something I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying all these years. It was like finding a part of myself I'd thought was lost forever, a piece that had been waiting patiently to come home. And as I turned the corner, heading back to the life I'd built, I knew that whatever happened next, I'd finally made peace with the past. And maybe, just maybe, that was all I needed. I was hiking alone, halfway up a trail that twisted through a quiet forest. The day was perfect, crisp air, golden sunlight filtering through the trees. But somehow, I'd taken a wrong turn and ended up on an unfamiliar path that seemed to go in circles. I pulled out my phone to check my map, but predictably, there was no service. I muttered to myself, trying to remember how I got here. Then, from up the trail, a voice called out, "Lost too?" I looked up to see a guy in a worn flannel and hiking boots, holding a water bottle and grinning as if he'd just caught me mid-confusion. Maybe, I admitted with a sheepish smile. This trail seemed easy until it wasn't. He laughed, coming closer. Same here. I was trying to find a lookout spot, but either it's invisible or I'm terrible with directions. We stood there for a moment, studying our surroundings. The trees seemed to lean in, silently laughing at us, and the whole situation felt a little absurd. Finally, he shrugged and held out his hand. I'm Ben, by the way. Lost hiker number 1. I shook his hand, laughing. Nice to meet you, Ben. Lost hiker number 2, also known as Emma. Since we're both wandering aimlessly, want to team up? He asked, his grin warm and easy. 2 lost heads are better than 1, right? I hesitated, but he had a friendly vibe that put me at ease. All right, but if we end up in some survival movie situation, I get the last granola bar. Deal, he said, chuckling. We started walking together, talking and joking as if we'd known each other longer than 5 minutes. He told me about his hiking adventures, some successful, some equally misguided, and I share my own stories, including the time I accidentally locked myself out of my apartment in pajamas. As we climbed higher, the trees thinned, and suddenly we stumbled onto an open clearing with a breathtaking view. The valley stretched out below, drenched in shades of green and gold, with the river winding through it like a ribbon. We both stopped, awestruck. "Wow," he whispered, and I nodded, feeling like we'd uncovered something magical. We sat down on a rock, still taking in the view, sharing a quiet moment that felt surreal. The whole hike had been chaotic, but somehow we'd ended up exactly where we were supposed to be. He passed me his water bottle, and we just sat there swapping stories and snacks, as if we'd been planning this all along. After a while, he looked at me, a playful glint in his eye. "All right, lost hiker number 2. How about a selfie to commemorate our accidental adventure?" We leaned in, grinning at the camera as he snapped the photo. Then, he looked at me a little more serious. "You know, this might be one of the best hikes I've had in a long time. I'm glad I got lost today." "Me too," I said softly, surprised at how true it felt. As we finally made our way down, laughing and stumbling over rocks, he slowed down when we reached the end of the trail. "So, should we do this again? Maybe on purpose next time?" he asked, smiling hopefully. I handed him my phone. "I'd like that. Just promise not to get us lost again, all right?" He laughed, adding his number. "No promises, but at least we know it leads somewhere amazing." Story 29. We were childhood friends, the kind of friends who knew each other's family secrets, who spent entire summers at each other's houses, who shared 1,000 memories and inside jokes that no one else understood. He was always the first person I'd call when something amazing happened or when I was falling apart. We'd seen each other through everything: bad grades, family drama, first heartbreaks. I thought I knew everything about him, every side of him, and he knew every side of me. But sometimes, I guess, even your closest friends can still surprise you. It all changed one evening last spring. We'd both come home for a weekend from different cities, both of us tired and needing a break. We planned to meet up for dinner, just to catch up like we always did. But when I walked into the little restaurant where we'd agreed to meet, he looked different somehow. More grown up, maybe, or just different. We spent hours there, talking and laughing, and it felt like time was standing still. I don't know what it was, maybe the warmth of the evening, maybe the wine, or maybe just seeing him through a new lens. But for the first time, I found myself really looking at him. After dinner, we took a walk, wandering through the quiet streets of our old neighborhood, talking about everything and nothing. At some point, we stopped under the dim glow of a street lamp, and he looked at me with an intensity one hadn't seen before. "Do you ever think about us?" he asked, his voice so soft it was almost a whisper. I froze, caught completely off guard. "Us?" I repeated, not quite sure I understood. He looked away, a little embarrassed, and said, "I mean more than friends." My heart started pounding, and suddenly I felt like I couldn't breathe. I had spent so many years pushing down any hint of those feelings, dismissing them as ridiculous, as impossible. But hearing him say it, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes, I couldn't pretend anymore. I could barely manage to nod, and the next thing I knew, he was leaning in, his lips brushing against mine so softly it almost felt like a dream. That kiss changed everything. It was like a dam broke, flooding me with feelings I didn't even know I'd been holding back. We spent the rest of that night together, talking, laughing, kissing, both of us a little dazed by this new thing between us. By the time the sun rose, I was convinced that somehow this had been meant to happen all along, that he was my person and always had been. But reality set in all too quickly. The next morning, we both had to leave for our separate lives, and as the days went on, our messages became more strained. We tried to talk about it, try to make sense of what had happened, but the timing was all wrong. We were both busy, both in different cities, both terrified of losing the friendship that meant so much to us. The more we tried to just go back to normal, the more painful it became. I could feel him pulling away, and I didn't know how to stop it. One night, After a particularly tense conversation, I finally asked him if he regretted it. His silence was answer enough. I hung up, feeling a hollow ache that I'd never felt before, a kind of loss that was worse than any breakup I'd ever been through. I'd lost my best friend, and something even more fragile, something that had barely begun to exist. We didn't speak for weeks after that. I tried to focus on work, tried to convince myself that it was for the best, that this was just a hard lesson about blurred boundaries. But every time I saw something funny, every time something exciting or frustrating happened, my first instinct was to tell him. And every time, I had to remind myself that he wasn't there anymore. Months went by, and I tried to move on. I even started dating someone else, someone kind and funny who treated me well. But there was always this gap, this hollow place where he used to be. I missed him fiercely, more than I could explain to anyone, and I started to think maybe I'd never really get over him. Then one night, out of nowhere, he called. Just seeing his name on my phone made my heart race. I hesitated, almost too afraid to answer, but finally I picked up. His voice was quiet, tentative. "Hey," he said like no time had passed. "Can we talk?" We met up at a coffee shop the next day, and the moment I saw him, all of my anger and hurt melted away. He looked as exhausted as I felt, like he'd been carrying around the same heavy sadness. After an awkward start, he finally took a deep breath and said, "I was scared. Scared of messing everything up, of losing you. But not having you in my life has been so much worse." The relief that flooded through me was indescribable. We sat there for hours, talking about everything, pouring out every regret, every feeling we'd been too afraid to admit. By the end of it, I knew I couldn't pretend anymore. I loved him, and I was ready to risk everything for a chance to be with him. This time, we decided to take it slow. No pressure, no expectations, just us figuring it out as we went along. There were bumps along the way, moments of doubt and fear, but every time, we'd come back to each other, stronger than before. Now, he's not just my best friend. He's my partner, my home, my everything. Some days, I still marvel at how we got here, how something so fragile survived everything we put it through. It's not a perfect fairy tale, but it's real, and it's ours. And as long as he's by my side, I know it's worth every risk, every moment of uncertainty.